You know each other?
Okay, we're live.
I was here last time, and I was in Andy Thomas's class.
Oh, yeah. Oh, hey, that's right. I didn't recognize you. Yeah, how you
That's
doing?
so
Come on.
Yeah,
so random. We love? Yeah.
Will
Okay.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the 25th January 2025 edition of Saturday Free School for 2010 Black Liberation. Before we get to today's discussion, I just wanted to mention that next Sunday, that's the 2nd February, we're going to have an event at the October Gallery celebrating Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. And there's going to be discussion by people from the free school. And the Saturday after that, that's the 8th of Feb, there's going to be a screening of the preschool produced documentary on James Baldwin, which is titled To Answer the Unanswered and to Fulfill the Unfulfilled, the Revolutionary James Baldwin. And it's going to be screened in Chicago, and there's going to be a community discussion following it. And it's going to be organized by members from preschool. So after that, so today we'll talk about, yes.
And Monday, we will end the year Baldwin reading at the Central Branch of the Free Library with the showing of the film If Beale Street Could Talk.
Yeah, January 27th.
That'll be at 6 o'clock.
Yeah.
So lots of events lined up for us. But this week has been important, and we've just had the inauguration as the 47th president of the US of Donald Trump. And this week has been important because we have been watching. I think everyone has been watching this week and what Trump's presidency is going to mean. And so today we're going to talk about what we can say about the future that's coming up based on the week that has been, and how do we assess Trump's presidency. And so I'll hand it over to Jeremiah to begin our discussion.
Yeah, I'll just start talking about Trump, but we'll have a larger discussion because I know that people probably have many thoughts. But yeah, I was just thinking about it, and one of the things that I realized was it's a little bit, to me at least, it feels a little bit strange or almost surreal to be talking about Trump or just talking in free school in the new presidency, because at least for myself and maybe for a few other people, some of us joined free school basically when Biden became president. And so I feel I've gotten used to free school during also the age of the Biden presidency. So yeah, but I guess I want to start by actually bringing us back to where we ended the conversation last Saturday and talking about essentially a series of the state in particular. And I also want to bring up, Lenin's theory of the state, because I think one of the reasons why I like Lenin a lot, even if we maybe see things differently in 2025, is that, when Lenin is writing State and Revolution, which is published, I think, in 1917, a few months before the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution, it's the way that I kind of see it is that Lenin in that time is putting forward what you could call a testable hypothesis for what is the state, what is the new kind of rule that is needed in a democratic society, all that stuff. But it's he's putting forward what you could call a testable hypothesis with this kind of absolute intention of carrying out that project and carrying out that kind of experiment, basically, almost 2 months later with the Russian Revolution. And so I just wanted to bring that up because I think that, in free school, obviously, we've talked many, many times about theories of the state, theories of, or just largely more about even what is the logic of the American revolutionary process. We've talked a lot about Trump and what he represents as a kind of historical phenomenon and current social phenomenon. And, especially for these past 4 years, I think we've been also, the American people have been kind of dealing with Trump as more as kind of the figurehead of the MAGA movement and the leader of that movement, and also kind of a voice of the opposition against the Democratic Party and against kind of the elites that are consolidated in that party. But, now I think especially with Trump assuming office, all of the questions that we've been talking about, they've become much more concrete, I think, and this is a good thing. But I think it's also, I guess, important in the sense that I feel like, we, like, actually this past week in like the Lucian Blackwell reading group, we talked about Trump a bit. And I think like this is very obvious to say, but it is true that many people, at least actually probably most people, already have like pretty strong kind of dispositions in how they think about Trump and how they see him. And, like we've talked about this many times, but like, the left, most of the left will say that basically he's a fascist, and that if the Biden administration did anything wrong, it's handing over the country to fascists, basically. But then they'll contradict themselves and they say, like, actually, no, Trump is just another oligarch. And so it's like, there's also, like, obviously there's that contradiction, but, in free school, we have our own way of seeing Trump and of seeing the crisis of American society. And I think related to that, we ask our own questions independent of whatever, the left thinks or what other people think. And so some of those questions are essentially, yeah, like what is the nature of the American state and how does it function? Who are the ruling elite in this country? And then what is going to be Trump's relationship to them? And I don't know, I was just thinking about like even like how to make sense of Trump, just because there's been like such this like almost like tidal wave of news and stuff in the past week, basically. But one thing that I think immediately I've noticed, I think, especially with Trump, is like Trump sees himself like if you read his or watch his inauguration speech or read it, like probably one of the only presidents that Trump actually mentions is William McKinley from the 18th century. And I actually think it's pretty interesting to like go back to the 19th century. And I know that I've seen other articles comparing Trump to Andrew Jackson, actually, and kind of his coalition of essentially like poor whites and then the former slaveholders. And then, they compare that to Trump's coalition of basically like working class Americans and like all these like kind of Silicon Valley titans. But I actually think for me, the more interesting comparison, and the comparison which is not talked about anywhere else, is actually this question of what Du Bois examines in Black Reconstruction, which is abolition democracy, or this term that he uses is abolition democracy, which on the one hand you can like kind of interpret as, Du Bois making the case of like, okay, what does democracy mean when it's explicitly kind of focused on this question of the emancipation of the enslaved. But I think the other way of interpreting, that even that term of abolition democracy that Du Bois uses is like, if you think about in basically the 19th century, you have this burgeoning abolitionist movement, the kind of emancipation movement, which kind of also comes into force during the Civil War. Like one of the questions that Du Bois asked in Black Reconstruction is like, what does a movement look like in power once it achieves power? And this is especially becomes relevant in the South after the downfall of the planter aristocracy that Du Bois describes. And I think obviously this is not to equate the Trump movement or the MAGA movement with like the abolition movement of the 19th century, but I guess the reason why I bring it up is because there's certain kinds of like political, historical, social dynamics that become actually, yeah, again, very concrete and very interesting to talk, like to even like look at and examine and think about. Of like, you have this movement which has been, especially with Trump, like unfolding over the past couple of years and developing. But then, what does that movement look like once it's actually achieved power? And I think related to that, like other questions that we ask are, yeah, like what will the American people do in this time, in this new kind of chapter of this country's history? And especially like those millions of people who either voted for Trump, but also all those millions of people who, even if they didn't vote for Trump, in their own ways dealt a defeat to the Democratic Party and to that establishment. Can we say that the American people have shown actually that they're willing to, I guess the way that I was trying to think about it, like, have the people shown that they're willing to essentially raise the stakes of struggle and of essentially also raise the stakes of contradiction for like the country as a whole? And I think the other questions I've been thinking about is like, which ideological questions is Trump putting on the table? And then more importantly, which questions will the people themselves put on the table, whether it's through Trump or otherwise? And so I just bring those up because I think it's like, for me, these are the kinds of questions I've been thinking about, because ultimately all of this stuff is going to be tested in reality. And like our role and our job is to always be open to reality and actually looking at it in that lens. And then, so I guess I just want to say that to start. And then the other thing I want to bring up before even getting to like this past week is basically going back to 2017 to Trump's first inauguration and his first presidency. And it's funny, I was telling Doc this, but actually, when Trump was inaugurated on January 20th in 2017, I was in DC with a few other people who are now part of Free School, protesting, because I was like a college student back then. I was like, I don't know, like we thought that Trump was like going to deport all of our friends. We were like really scared, like all that stuff. And, you know, actually that was a very important experience for me, I guess. Like maybe we can talk about later, but I realized that, you know, because I was so busy protesting in 2017, I never actually listened or read Trump's first inauguration speech. And actually, I encourage people to go back and reread it, because I think it's actually, to me at least, I feel like it's a better speech than his 2025 speech. In part because, like, if you allow me to just like read like a small portion of it. Yeah, but okay, so basically, and he kind of repeats these themes, but basically Trump says, for too long, and this is Trump in 2017, he says, for too long, a small group in our nation's capital has reaped the rewards of government while the people have borne the cost. Washington flourished, but the people did not share in its wealth. Politicians prospered, but the jobs left and the factories closed. The establishment protected itself, but not the citizens of our country. Their victories have not been your victories. And he's talking to the American people. Their triumphs have not been your triumphs. And while they celebrated in our nation's capital, there was little to celebrate for struggling families all across our land. And that all changes starting right here and right now, because this moment is your moment. It belongs to you. What truly matters is not which party controls our government, but whether our government is controlled by the people. And so January 20th, 2017 will be remembered as the day the people became the rulers of this nation again. The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer. Everyone is listening to you now. And I don't know, I just feel like, yeah, I encourage people to go back and read that speech, because I think whether or not you see Trump as like a cynical actor, I think it's very clear that like Trump basically has this like theory of what's happening in America, and was basically able in a way that no other figure was in 2017 to like, or 2016, to actually understand what was happening with the American people in that time. And I also bring up 2017 because I do think it's worth comparing not just what Trump was saying back then versus what he's saying now, but also comparing the reaction to Trump in 2017 versus the reaction now, because I do think that there's important differences. And I think, at least from what I experienced back then, also having been part, like kind of seeing myself more as part of quote unquote the resistance, at least initially, to Trump, as it was called, was like, yeah, in 2017, like the reaction to Trump was horror, it was disbelief, and it was hysteria. And it was all these things like, you know, there was Russiagate, which I feel like people have kind of forgotten. I think Trump has forgotten. And essentially you see this kind of like full system, whole of society attack on Trump, basically for the entire duration of his presidency. And, you know, fast forward to today, like Trump has not just had 4 years in power from 2017, but he's also had 4 years in between then to prepare for this new term. And I think it's also fair to say that like Trump, not even as an individual, but that like this kind of larger phenomenon, he essentially defines like this chapter of American history that we're all living through. And so I don't know, I just wanted to bring that up because I feel like it is like one of the things that I wanted to talk about with you guys is just like, yeah, why is there a difference in how the ruling elite are reacting to Trump today versus like his first term, and like why is that the case, and how is it going to look like? And the other thing I want to say is like, you know, in basically starting from his speech this past week at NDC, and also what feels like, again, like this kind of avalanche of like executive orders, actions, statements that he's making. Again, like I think Trump is putting forward his theory of himself and of America, and his theory of how to govern, and his theory also of retribution in his terms, who to target in the government and how to do it. And so I guess, yeah, like I guess just to like go directly to like his inauguration this past week, you know, Trump starts out by basically saying in front of Biden, Harris, both Hillary and Bill Clinton, Obama, George Bush Jr., like he basically starts by saying this, and this is, yeah, from his quote from this past week, but he says, "As we gather today, our government confronts a crisis of trust. For many years, a radical and corrupt establishment has extracted power and wealth from our citizens while the pillars of our society lay broken and seemingly in complete disrepair. And we now have a government that cannot manage even a simple crisis at home, while at the same time stumbling into a continuing catalog of catastrophic events abroad. And he continues and he's saying this, but like basically, like there are many kind of through lines from that 2017 speech to today. But part of what's interesting is like, especially with that kind of, because the inauguration this time was happening in that room because of the cold, I guess. Like, and you could actually see the reactions of people directly of everyone who was sitting there. Especially like the Clintons, like Biden, Harris, Obama, Bush Jr. And I feel like probably Doc, you've been more closely examining the body language and facial reactions of all these people, so you can probably describe it better. But I just want to say that it's like Trump is saying all this stuff like directly in front of all of those people, and he's saying like, yeah, you guys are the establishment, this corrupt establishment, which has gotten rich and wealthy, and also has betrayed the trust of the American people. And he's saying this basically directly to their faces. But then at the same time, I think this is something that people have also talked a lot about. At the same time, you have all those kind of political elites there. You also have the presence of all these basically like, especially these big tech CEOs at the inauguration, and who seem to be in alignment with Trump. And not just like Elon Musk, but also like these CEOs of like Google, Facebook or Meta, Amazon. And then now I think recently also Trump kind of made this big announcement of like this $500 billion project with OpenAI and other tech companies to essentially invest in like data centers for AI. And so I think it is good for us to actually like scrutinize what's happening here. And especially given like, again, comparing that kind of radical shift from the first term of Trump's presidency, in which you had all these social media companies basically arrayed against Trump and united against Trump, and essentially, like also deplatforming Trump because they saw him as like quote unquote this threat to democracy. But now, like all of a sudden, they seem to be playing nice, and I think Trump also like he kind of enjoys this kind of thing, and he kind of likes playing people and like trying to get them to like I don't know whether it's like bow down or whatever. But I think obviously many people have said like, oh, this is a sign that Trump's presidency will be this kind of hyper-consolidated plutocracy or rule by the wealthy or this oligarchic rule. But I feel like the thing is like America has already been ruled by the ultra wealthy and by these networks of big business and like these political elites. And I think it's just that like it hasn't been as upfront and as visible, or it's not, you don't associate it with like kind of the brazen nature of Trump's personality also. And so again, this brings us to the question like, yeah, who are the ruling elite? And Doc has also brought up this question like, how we define the ruling class of this country is essentially, at least we view it as who controls the commanding heights of the state.
I think so.
And we view the state as not just the federal government, but it's kind of this broader network of institutions that rule society. And so that is, essentially like the deep state, the security state, especially the establishment in Washington, but it is also these giants of Silicon Valley. They're the ones who also, I think, especially in this time, along with the mainstream media and elite universities, they're kind of positioned as the ones who control the means of information and the means of the flow of ideas. But it's also like those people, but it's also like Wall Street, the finance capitalists. So I think like we kind of take maybe not a kind of conventional Marxist view of how we define the ruling class, but we adopt maybe a more sociological way of defining the ruling elite of this country and how do they reproduce themselves, whether as a class or as a kind of like social network. Well, I just bring that up because I think it's also important to be clear on those questions or to actually like think clearly about those questions, because the big question today is like, how are the ruling elite figuring out how to relate to Trump and how to manage Trump, or how to just deal with this? Because I think it is true that they basically had like more than 8 years of dealing with Trump and this phenomenon, and they've tried like basically everything that they could in their kind of arsenal to like either discredit him, to criminalize him and his followers, to disqualify him from running for office, and also potentially assassinating him. Like I think all of that stuff was on the table. And I think that my interpretation right now of what's going on is that significant parts of the ruling elite recognize that they can't try the same thing that they did basically in the first term of his presidency. And I think that they also recognize, like, I think there is a similar kind of hysteria that has reemerged, but I don't think that they're as invested in trying to stoke exactly that kind of same hysteria that they did in 2017 with the whole quote unquote resistance and with Russiagate and all that stuff. And I think part of this is actually because, I don't know if this is like going too far, but I think part of it is that the ruling elite are actually at this point either scared of the people or they're like a little bit unsure of how to relate to the people, because they're, in particular, they're not like, if they go so hard after Trump in the way that they did in 2017, I think they, like, the elite recognize like that the reaction from the people will be much, much worse than January 6th. And I think that I think there's a lot of caution and hesitancy basically about how to manage that, because of what they essentially have recognized of like, okay, like the American people are not going to quote unquote go back to normal. And they are committed, whether it's like Trump or just basically this whole like larger thing of like, they're not going to go back to like this time of like, oh, like we can just kind of go back and pretend that the kind of stability of the two-party system is always going to be there forever. The stability of what we said, the center of American politics is going to hold forever. I think that the elite have to recognize basically that there is no going back to that status quo. And I think this also explains why the so-called resistance from the left has been so weak in its response to Trump in basically in the past week, where it's like, you know, back in the day, like, and I count myself as like being part of this, and we thought, you know, we had the moral high ground against Trump, you know, but it actually turns out, and it's like all these resistance liberals and these leftists who essentially thought that they defeated Trump in 2020, you know, they brought in a president in Biden who then willingly signed on to a genocide and provided cover for the Israelis to carry out that genocide. And so this is why I think, you know, there's been a lot of headlines about that. I think she's an Episcopal minister who kind of spoke back at Trump and was like, oh, Mr. President, like have mercy on these immigrants and stuff. But it's like, you know, Electronic Intifada actually had a good video about this minister, but it's like all these people, like I see them as morally bankrupt. It's like you didn't say anything when, yeah, like the Biden administration was carrying out a genocide, but now you pretend to have the moral high ground again, and like you pretend like you think that you care about all these immigrants. But it's like no, like I just feel like we've moved past that point, and I think actually like large parts of the left, whether they admit it or not, like there's this kind of subconscious thing of like, oh, like actually you can't make that case of a moral high ground anymore. And so I think related to that, I do think that some parts of the elite, and I'm speaking mostly about the Silicon Valley people, but also parts of the media too, because, you know, there's kind of Washington Post, for instance, they changed their motto from like democracy dies in darkness to like, what is it, telling riveting storytelling for all of America. I don't know, it's like bullshit stuff, but it's like this is them trying to like basically say like, oh no, the media, the mainstream media is like, maybe some parts of it are still kind of in the resistance against Trump, but they're trying to, you know, accommodate, they're trying to shift, they're trying to adapt. And I think actually the strategic calculus for this is that I do think that parts of the elite are essentially trying to like in their own way normalize Trump and the MAGA base. But the hope is that because they're normalizing Trump, that their hope is that Trump and MAGA will behave, quote unquote, normally. But I don't think this is going to happen. And yeah, there is this looming question of whether something Trump's mass kind of populist base will tolerate Trump's kind of own attraction to this kind of like techno-futurist vision of like Elon Musk, of Peter Thiel, of like Sam Altman of OpenAI, and all these people, and this kind of idea that like you can reindustrialize America through like data centers for like artificial intelligence. I think that yeah, like there's this looming kind of tension and conflict that's going to have to play out, and you also see it playing out in the kind of whole debate before Trump assumed office of like the whole H-1B visa debate of like essentially it's like Trump also is like, oh, like I like H-1B visas, but then at the same time you have his base, which is like, no, like actually follows through on this whole immigration thing. But then you also have the tech people. So I think I just brought that up because I think this also brings us to, I think, some of the tensions that we're already feeling a few days into the administration, in which kind of the paradox of this particular time for Trump is that on the one hand, Trump draws his power from his antagonism to the ruling elite. This is where he draws his legitimacy from the American people. And so I think in the first term, actually in a weird way, Trump benefited from the fact that he did face like genuine opposition everywhere, including from his like not just from his own party, but even from people that he appointed, like John Bolton, you know, like Mike Pompeo, all these people. And so Trump could reasonably say, the elite and the establishment are preventing me from carrying out the mandate. But I think this is also what has made it hard to tell with Trump, what from him is just bluster and rhetoric versus what is actually real. Because actually, like this whole thing, even this whole thing about deportations, like we made such a big deal about Trump deporting people in his first term, but actually it turns out both Obama and Biden actually arrested and deported much more people than Trump's first term. And so, but I think that, so I think that kind of creates a sense of like, oh, like Trump has rhetoric, but he's not going to back it up. But I think on the other hand, like I think Trump has basically spent the last 4 years preparing to carry out what he thinks is his mandate. And so I think like it is an open question. Like, is he serious about, for instance, like deporting foreign students who, in his words, quote unquote, support Hamas and Hezbollah? Is he serious about deploying the National Guard and the US military to American cities to carry out the mass deportations and stuff like that? And I think like the dynamics of what's going to happen, I think, are actually very uncertain in that sense, because Trump on one hand has consolidated his movement and he now dominates the Republican Party. And last night, like he just got Pete Hegseth kind of approved for the Department of Defense, with JD Vance tie-breaking the vote after I think it was Mitch McConnell and like 2 other Republican senators who had defected and voted against Hegseth. And so he has consolidated the party. And I think the opposition from within the Republican Party, which it's going to be much less than I think it was in the first term. And so I do think it's true that he's in some ways almost like put the ruling elite on the back foot. And he does have this stronger he has almost an even stronger mandate from his own base of how to govern, and this expectation from the people that he thinks of like, oh, like what he needs to deliver on. And he has this like, basically like, it is very clear, like all these executive orders he signed, like Trump has an actual plan of how he thinks he should govern. But the question is, like we've raised this before, but like what will be the actual policies that he carries out, and then how will the people respond? And then, okay, I have a few other things I want to talk through, but the other kind of major theme that I think is Trump has kind of put on the table is even this question of like America itself. And, in his inauguration speech, the first thing that he says is like, quote unquote, the golden age of America begins right now. So if you like compare 2017, very dark, he has that word American carnage that people remember, but then supposedly 2025 now is going to be like all bright and sunny. He's like, sunshine is pouring all across the globe and all this stuff. And I just bring it up because I do think that like actually in his own way, I feel like more than any other figure, at least alive in America today, Trump does capture something in the American spirit and all of its contradictions. And Trump is basically saying like, I am the people, not just like I am say, but like I am the people. And in his mind, the American people are like, the frontiersmen, like the rabble. And I think the words that he used were like the explorers, the builders, the innovators, the entrepreneurs, the pioneers. Obviously, missing from that is like the enslaved. But Trump has this like vision of America, and he talks about like America pushing through like these untamed, like taming the untamed wilderness, crossing deserts, kind of like all this hierarchy also of like America, of American exceptionalism, and he connects it to like space travel. And I think that like Trump in his own way really does believe in like manifest destiny, and he believes in like American exceptionalism. And he's also literally saying like part of America's manifest destiny is to like, for instance, like plant the stars and stripes on Mars. And like it is ridiculous, but like this kind of both funny but also like very serious, like weird vision that Trump has of America, I think is actually much truer to like the kind of essence of America as a contradiction. And like Trump does believe that he is a man of destiny, which we've talked about before. And I think it's very obvious that, this is like a very white view of the world and of America. But I think at the same time, like it is part of that peculiar American drama, which I think like Du Bois and Baldwin also recognize and like speak about in their own ways. And I think if you look at it like dialectically, part of the question that I see that Trump puts on the table is this whole thing of like America, like the American dream, American exceptionalism is basically, like for the people to discuss in an actual concrete way, what is America about? What defines America? And I think that is an actual like question that Trump puts on the table. Not just that like he obviously has his own vision for it, but I think like it is a question that actually people like it is a question for the people to discuss. And then obviously the other kind of big theme that has emerged in the past couple like weeks is basically this question of peace and of American empire. And I do think that actually one of the big changes in the past 8 years is that Trump really now sees himself as like a peacemaker. And he says this in his inauguration speech where he says, we will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but by the wars we end.
Right.
And most importantly, by the wars that we never get into. And my proudest legacy will be that of a peacemaker and unifier. And that's what I want to be, a peacemaker and a unifier. And, you know, people can look at this cynically, but I think it's important that like Trump, literally he sees himself like in that, like, he sees himself as like, oh, I want my legacy to be that. And yeah, like we've talked about this last week, but yeah, like basically in the past couple of weeks, Trump has essentially, it looks like, enforced a ceasefire on Israel, even while at the same time it's clear that he's granted certain concessions to Israel. Trump gave this kind of virtual speech recently at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where he says essentially like, we want to have good relationship with China. We want to work with China on ending the war in Ukraine. We want to pursue denuclearization with Russia and China. But then at the same time, he's like, oh, I'm threatening more sanctions on Russia. So obviously, like, the contradictions are there. Like, they're very obvious, and it's very obvious, like, see them. And so, but then also, like, at the same time, like, Trump, it seems like, has ordered actually a halt, a stop to all foreign aid to all countries, with the exception of Israel and Egypt for some interesting reason. But that also includes Ukraine, supposedly. And I think people have also noted like this kind of internal war in the Republican Party about whether or not, you know, the people like Steve Witkoff, who's kind of the Middle East person who negotiated the ceasefire or forced a ceasefire on Netanyahu, a lot of the neocons in the Republican Party or the GOP establishment are really opposed to him staying in the administration. But yeah, I think it's very clear that like Trump sees one of his mandates from his own base as the mandate for peace. And obviously this mandate is now colliding with Trump's other interests and like how he's being influenced and his like the agenda that he's setting. Because I think, you know, this also connects to this question of American imperialism, but we've talked about Trump being a president for what we've termed as imperial retreat. And the funny thing is that actually I've wondered like, oh, maybe Trump is taking that literally, but he's like literally trying to like roll back America from this age of, you know, post World War II global US empire thing back to almost like this 19th century vision of America, still as an empire, but like a regional empire, like a hemispheric empire with dominance over only really the Western hemisphere. And actually, if that's true, I think actually this is interestingly Trump's way of responding to multipolarity. By Trump, basically Trump is suggesting that actually America's future is to be one pole in this kind of multipolar world and a kind of major power that dominates over its own continent while letting all these other poles kind of dominate their own regions. I think, you know, we've talked about kind of the flaws and the contradictions and even that kind of idea of multipolarity. But I do think like that's my kind of current hunch about how Trump is seeing things. And so this is also leads to Trump saying like in his own speech, like we want to take back the Panama Canal. Now we're going to take over Greenland. We're going to take over Canada. And like, I think Jahan's brought up or other people brought up like, oh, like maybe one of the ironies of this is like now Trump, aside from Panama, like Trump is now threatening imperialism against like white countries, ironically, whereas before like the kind of modus operandi for the American state is obviously imperialism against the darker nations. But, you know, I think that's true. But at the same time, like I personally don't really feel like America needs to take over Greenland or Iceland or like Canada or whatever, because I think it's in part because like it's not even because of the like, yes, it's part of like this whole like thing of like American expansionism, but also personally, I don't think that those countries or those people really have anything to do with the American experiment or the American struggle. And I don't see why we need to now include them in this whole, like this idea of America, when it's like America needs to figure its own shit out. And that's part of the kind of proposition that Trump has offered to the American people. But I guess I bring that up also because I think one of the interesting questions which is raised by Trump kind of trying to bring back the 19th century is that, one of these kind of peculiar laws or peculiar dynamics of how historical change happens is that oftentimes it's like the new or the not yet born presents itself through this kind of seeming return of the old. And I think this is the kind of clearest example of that, it's like actually American slavery, because you have what looks like a kind of old feudal system, but actually which is a new development, which then spurs the development of the United States and of this kind of all this stuff, which happens basically over the course of American history, in which, again, like slavery looks like an old thing, but it's actually the way that it's manifested and develops in American history is as something new, and it gives birth to this new historical category and phenomenon of Black proletariat. So I think I just bring that up. It's like it's all these like kind of interesting questions of like, like how does historical change happen? What is the new versus what is old? And so I just wanted to bring that up. And then I guess the last kind of section of this is actually going through Trump's executive orders. And obviously there are too many to like really talk through all of them in detail. But I think my understanding of part of what Trump is doing right now is that I think he gets this from Steve Bannon, but like the kind of larger strategy is like essentially flooding the zone of basically people's consciousness and flooding the zone of the news and information. So basically, like there's almost like too much like news to keep track of. And I think like I was reading that he started on day one of his term by signing 26 executive orders. In comparison, in 2017, he signed like one. And I think like most presidents have like signed at most like one or two executive orders on their first day in office. And I think obviously people have probably been reading like each of these executive orders has its own kind of legality, its own kind of constitutional authority, and they can't all be seen as the same. And so some of them are basically symbolic. Some of them actually do take immediate effect with the force of law, such as like him pardoning all these January 6 people. Other executive orders essentially are immediately being contested by the judicial system over whether or not they're constitutional. And then other executive orders are basically orders for like these different federal agencies to like look into something or to come up with a recommendation for something. But I think the larger picture of this is that Trump essentially is testing, again, his theory of the powers of the executive branch.
Right.
And I'm not saying, like, for me, it's not even a question of like whether it's good or bad or not. But what I think Trump is signaling both to the state and to the American people is that Trump is saying, like, I'm the one in power and I don't have to negotiate with Congress or play by the rules of Washington. And in his mind, I think like Trump has a legitimate case for this. The people, he's saying like, the people now have power through me. And I think the reason why actually Trump can do this, or there's the possibility for Trump to do this, is because essentially, like whatever all of these supposed checks and balances are in the federal government, most ordinary Americans don't actually see the government as being accountable to the people. So if Trump says like, oh no, like I don't give a shit about the kind of checks and balances of like the three different branches of government, like the American people's like, okay, like I don't really care because I don't see the government as being accountable to us anyways. And so in their own weird way, and again, I'm not saying this is good or bad, but like in his own weird way, for Trump's followers, Trump as like a figure represents a much more quote unquote democratic way to make change. And I do want to bring up that like in the history of executive orders, of which obviously there's been many, Lincoln's actually Emancipation Proclamation was a similar kind of executive order.
Really?
Yeah. So I think that like brings up, I guess, the history of like the role of the executive. But I guess to get into like the specific ones that I think people have thought a lot about or just seen a lot about is like immigration, obviously, in which Trump, it seems like, wants to end, or basically is ordering an end to birthright citizenship for people who are born to illegal immigrants and to people who are born on temporary visas, like work or student visas, which includes some people in preschool. So I think actually, without getting too much into like the details of it, what I feel like is actually at the core of this whole immigration thing is not really, again, like there is like the whole legal battle which is unfolding, and also this question of like the enforcement of deportations. But actually, I think the idea, like what part of what Trump is interested in is like, I'm going to put this question of immigration on the table for people to really debate. And for him, those questions are, like, who is an American? And why is it that the ruling elite seem to care more about people who just got here rather than care about all the people who already live here? And actually, in his own way, kind of like Trump's way of approaching this question of immigration is very much intrinsically tied to his question of wars. Because it's like, why does the government care about these immigrants, and why does it care about these wars rather than care about, you know, protecting or even having any kind of social contract with the people who live here? And you can like see that as kind of a fallacious kind of equation, but that's kind of how Trump presents this question of immigration to the people. And interestingly, again, yeah, like this whole question of birthright citizenship, it does go back to essentially like the case that's being made legally by Trump's team is based on an interpretation of the 14th Amendment, which then again brings us back to the 19th century and essentially how the 14th Amendment was defining citizenry originally for all these emancipated Black people in America. And I think, again, yeah, like, I guess the caveat that I'll say is that even while these are being presented as ideological questions, the reality is that actually all of these questions, whether it's like immigration, whether it's like, you know, energy or like DI, like all that stuff, like the deep state, ultimately all of these questions do have actual consequences for people and for the country in the way that all genuine ideological questions do throughout history. And then I think, you know, other kind of major points that Trump has tried to like basically force through, or at least has brought on the table, is like this question of like tariffs and energy. And, you know, Trump has this whole idea of like, basically by bringing back the style of governance from William McKinley in the 19th century and through tariffs, or at least through the threat of tariffs, we can somehow lead America back to this golden age of prosperity, basically by also, you know, kind of drastically increasing American energy production for like fossil fuels and for liquefied natural gas. And, you know, that's I feel like people have like talked about it a lot. Maybe other people have like more interesting thoughts on this, but the other thing that Trump has attacked is this whole kind of like DEI apparatus in the federal government, and also brought up this question of the actual legacy of the civil rights movement, where Trump has revoked or rescinded Lyndon B. Johnson's executive order from the time of the civil rights movement, which was like LBJ's order for, I think this is kind of in correspondence with the Bakke decision with the Supreme Court, but essentially mandating quote unquote affirmative action for like federal employees and also for federal contractors. And I think, yeah, probably Doc, you probably have more like actual like historical background on this, because we've talked about also like just this whole question of affirmative action before with the Supreme Court and stuff. But I think, again, to me, what's interesting with Trump attacking all of these like DEI programs and all these like all these staff people in the federal government who are like have these titles of like chief diversity officer for whatever is, you know, on the one hand, many people on the left will be like, oh, this is like a McCarthyist witch hunt against these people. But that kind of assumes that all these people who are getting paid with taxpayer money to do quote unquote DEI are actually doing anything that benefits Black people, much as anybody else in the American public. And I think, yeah, and again, in like a dialectical sense, the question that's now raised is when kind of it's stripped from the stranglehold of the Democratic Party, can the American people now discuss much more openly and honestly, like what is the true legacy of the civil rights movement and of the Black freedom movement? Because the move that the Democratic Party has been making for essentially the past like 8 years is that like diversity, equity, and inclusion is kind of the next stage of assuming the mantle of the civil rights movement. It's like when you strip that monopoly from the Democratic Party, that kind of narrative hegemony from the Democratic Party, like then the field of like actually like for the people to discuss, okay, like what is actually the legacy of the Third American Revolution, that field becomes much more wide open. And then I just wanted to end by, I guess, like talking about like this whole question of the deep state, where I think very publicly Trump has revoked the security details of John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, along with a lot of other people. I think also Anthony Fauci. And I think, you know, there's this kind of very public kind of battle that I guess Trump has been waging with like oftentimes like people that he would hire, but now he's fired them. And I think that's kind of the more visible part of Trump's kind of battle with what he calls the deep state. But I think actually to me what's more interesting is what gets less publicity, which is like his other executive orders, one of which is him reinstating what this thing that's called Schedule F, which makes it much easier to, it changes kind of the employment status of a lot of kind of career bureaucrats in the federal government, and it makes it much easier to fire them. And he's also kind of mandated this other executive order, which places much more higher scrutiny on these, what's called like these kind of senior executive service people in the kind of federal bureaucracy. And to me, like actually that stuff is a much more interesting part of like how Trump, even his theory of like who is in the deep state and how do we bring them out and how do we attack them. I think, yeah, like obviously, I guess I'll just end by saying, yeah, like time will tell if Trump can even be successful in that endeavor on his own terms, and then what the actual impacts will be. But I think it is like very clear that we're seeing the actual implementation of what Trump meant, and he said like many months ago, like to his base and to the American people, like I'm your retribution against the ruling elite. And I think obviously like the next 100 days of Trump's term, the next 4 years, like I think part of what I've been just trying to process is like, I think a lot of feelings of like uncertainty with what's going to happen. And I do think that the next 4 years are going to be very messy. And I think obviously also, like I said, like the people, it seems like part of how we understand this moment is that the people themselves have raised the stakes of struggle in this country. And I think with that, which is not to say obviously all the questions have been resolved, but yeah, I do think that with Trump and just basically where the country is moving, new possibilities are emerging, even if they kind of appear in this kind of very confused and not really crystallized form. And I think the other part of this is that like, part of what's been kind of funny to watch, but also interesting is that like Trump himself kind of represents for many people this kind of like crack in people's like whole sense of reality. I think actually Magna in like 2017 wrote this good essay describing Trump's election as this kind of crack and kind of also the American system of white supremacy. And I think related to that, you know, even for free school ourselves, like I think our own knowledge of America, I think, is going to be tested in these next 4 years. And I think like we have been doing, but I think especially in like going into what we assume will be the next 4 years of a Trump presidency, like I think it's good for us to like actually keep our eyes open and to like always be actually like seeing, okay, like what is actually happening, and like how do we make sense of it, and what are the real actual social and political and ideological forces at play. And yeah, so I guess I just want to end there, but I know it's like a lot of stuff to pick that up, but those are, to me, those are the things that like stand out and the kinds of questions that stand out as well. And like I said, I think that like in some ways, like, the benefit of a Trump presidency is a lot of things become much more concrete, which means like, okay, like we were right about this, like maybe we didn't see this fully. But it's always a continual process of actually like, you know, maintaining your sense of like actually reality as it's unfolding. So yeah, that's kind of, yeah, like my kind of initial thoughts and how I've been trying to make sense of, yeah, especially the past week or so.
Well, it's interesting because we had been talking about this, which is that the inauguration happened on MLK Day.
Oh yeah.
And we in the free school had talked about this idea of the man of destiny being king, and then the man of farce being Trump. And so just even in symbolic terms, for the inauguration to happen on MLK Day is very striking for those who actually understand King's legacy and also what Trump is doing. What's interesting is also what you said in terms of Trump being very American too. There's something about him, and I'm not quite sure if I can put it into words, where like Trump, and I like interact with people who are like very, because you see Trump and people are like, he's a billionaire and therefore he's a technocrat, oligarch, all this stuff. But actually the way Trump carries himself and talks, it reminds you more of a poor white than like I don't know, like the CEO, billionaire that you interact with. But then there is that component of you know, this confidence of Americans, where despite not completely knowing the situation, there's that manifest destiny cowboy ethic. But what's interesting is that essentially with Trump, you see this cowboy having to face or deal with what is happening in the world. And that's a contradiction with these this thing even with China, right? Where he understands that China is not to be played with. But there's this like DNA piece that's very white of, okay, then we're not going to go to war, which is fantastic. I think like that's fantastic. But at the same time, he's like, we're gonna, I don't know what to do, but we're gonna sanction them because, and it's like very American, right? Where it's a new situation, and all you know how to do is to kind of run yourself into the wall. And so it is very American and it's very poor white. Like it gives me that feeling. And I think what was also very clear about your presentation is, is Trump puts the questions on the table, whereas before it was all hidden. Like this question of the deep state, people think he's a what is it called? A conspiracy theorist. Like people are like, oh, what does he mean by the deep state? But then there's also the understanding that no one really trusts what is going on in the government and or believes that things will change no matter how much people protest. And so even this thing of like, it's very similar because I think he's working out this thing with like Elon Musk and Doge and Vivek, where it's like efficiency, like they call it like government efficiency, but essentially, and also in the corporate world where it's very clear that there's a ton of bureaucrats who don't do anything. And what he's attacking, which is different from Elon Musk in like a corporate setting, is that this is taxpayers' money and dollars, and they're not accountable. And so even like this whole thing of like all government workers have to be in office, like is the basis of that is, yeah, there's a bunch of people who are not the elite as well. I think the question that I still have, which is, and we've talked about it in previous free schools, is what is this I am the state, like Napoleonic way of governance, and how does it relate to democracy and what the people's will is? Because I think that's the part where it's, you know, the people have elected him, and then now how do democratic forms of governance take place? But it's very exciting and sometimes a lot of uncertainties. But I mean, seeing Trump, I think of King too, because we would probably say he needs to read a King essay or to learn how to speak like King or in that delivery. But it's also very exciting in an American way. It's full of drama. And I think it was for the first time that people actually listened to this. Like, I don't know how many, I mean, haven't lived that long, but in like previous inaugurations, do people listen or do they just tune out? And like news is also aware that the cycle is driven by Trump. People read things when they talk about Trump. And what was I going to say? I'm going to leave it there.
Right. You know, I mean, I was thinking like to what you started with, this question of the anti-Trump movement, how it was 8 years, 10 years back, and how it is now. And the question of who really is the ruling elite. I think I feel like, you know, this is the most important question because we can't really understand what Trump is or how do you assess Trump without seeing that, okay, the fact that he is the president doesn't mean that he is the ruling elite now. Like Trump's election signals like what was defeated was not the ruling elite, but the lapdog of the ruling elite. And I mean, yeah, like looking at like what you were saying, all these, the Clintons and like Biden, Harris, and all of that. I mean, yeah, it looked like they're, like they look like their brains are melting now because everything that they've been saying for the last 10 years has been challenged and put in the dustbin, and they have to sit and take it. But the ruling elites actually want war. I mean, that's what we've seen. The ruling elite has been fighting for, they've been trying to get regime change all over the world. And I think now the last few years has proved that they're incapable of doing it. So if regime change if they're not capable of doing that, then World War III is the only option for them, right? So that's the path that they're on. And so, of course, everything that Trump is going to do and say, I mean, it seems to me like he's also in some ways performing for the ruling elite while he is elected on the mandate of the American people. I mean, for instance, I mean, I was thinking of, the whole Ukraine stuff. He has like stopped all aid to Ukraine, but then the new thing for people to critique him on is the fact that he's talking about more sanctions on Russia, and now the left is coming and talking about, the world doesn't run according to you, you're not like they're trying to portray him as like a dictator and so on. But the thing is, this is pretty much exactly what the ruling elite has been saying forever, like Dharma was saying. And I think Trump's saying this uh, on top of stopping aid to Ukraine and ending the war. I don't think it's schizophrenic of Trump. I think it's him trying to play the game in whatever, I guess what you were saying is the Trumpian theory of change. And so I was thinking that like even to see the ceasefire in Gaza, and then him not stopping the aid to Israel. Okay, I mean, we know that the ruling elite is like, that's completely Zionist, and so the transformation of the ruling elite has not yet happened. And so I don't even think it's reasonable to expect that this change is going to happen with one election. But I think the fight is going on, and everything that Trump is doing right now is, I mean, I think it's a question of life and death for the ruling elite, and they're going to fight tooth and nail with it. And everything that Trump is saying is also in some ways to it's to perform for the elite, to try to hold on, to try to uh, let them have some of their narrative, while on the other hand he's basically trying to gut them. I mean, that's what I feel, that everything that he's actually doing is an attempt to gut the ruling elite. And on top of that, he's not a cold-blooded revolutionary, so he is going to perform for them. And I think that's what he's sort of doing. Like, everything he says about, we're not stopping, we're still going to sanction Russia if we want to. We are still going to, I have all of these, like the whole AI infrastructure, 500 billion and all of that. And then, yes, we're not yet ending aid to Israel. But I mean, the way the ceasefire deal was achieved, if Israel breaks 3 months down the line, which they probably will, I mean, this is probably the next step. He'll be forced to end all aid to Israel. But that's probably the biggest shift in U.S. foreign policy in since the Second World War. The U.S. state stands with Israel as, I mean, they're one thing. Like, we've been talking about this for a while, but that change is I think that's a tectonic shift in the foreign policy. It's not going to happen unless it's absolutely unavoidable. Which, I mean, I'm thinking that that's going to be the way it goes 3 months down the line if this fight is breached. But anyway, that's what I was thinking. The other thing I was thinking was, like his relationship with the ruling elite. I was watching the Trump speech at the World Economic Forum, And that's who, like those are the ones, like that is the ruling elite. And you can see the contempt they have for him. You can see the way they talk to him, the way they, I mean, it's not even the contempt for him, it's the contempt for the American people and him standing on the mandate of the American people. I mean, you can see how they talk to him, and like Trump, everything that Trump says to them, I think that's when he sounds the most, the almost like he's trying to perform in some way for them. He's not, yeah, he's not going to, I mean, he is afraid of them, I think. I mean, he's still, the way he talks to them, it's not like he doesn't talk to the folks at Davos the way he would talk to a Biden or the whole Democratic Party establishment. And I think that's where the real like the actual equation between the ruling elite and the people are sort of revealed. I thought it was revealed in the way they talk to and about Trump, like in those heights. So yeah, that's what I was. I wanted to say something else. Um, oh yeah, the other thing I was thinking was this question of uncertainty that yeah, it is uncertain about what direction the administration, but also we're all going to go in what direction America is going to go. What do we, the American people, have in store for us? And the way the ruling elite is putting this is, okay, this is the consequence of this intense chaotic administration that we have. But I think this is also proof that, okay, the ruling elite no longer has it no longer has a handle on its narrative, which always predicts a certain outcome which is never followed. But you've had the legitimacy to claim uh, your theory of how the world functions, in what ways the American people move or are going to move, and all of that is up for grabs now. And to what you were saying initially about the theory of the state, I guess it actually reminded me of, well, this essay which we've read before in preschool by Baldwin, called "This Far and No Further." And like I was reminded of this because of the question of, to understand Trump, we need to understand Trump and where we are, where the American people are today. We need to update our understanding of what the state means now. And I think that Baldwin is closest to to saying something useful about the state now. I think more than Lenin. And I just want to read a couple of lines from the essay. That's fine. So he starts this essay. It's called "This No Further," and he says, "It is hard to be clear in these matters, yet I hazard that society with a capital S is a direct result of the actual and moral options offered by the state. And yet, on the other hand, the state as we know it is very largely, if not entirely, the result of the actual and moral exhaustion of society with a small s. The actual baffling, continuing, and wounding relations which obtain among human beings cause us to long for authority as deeply as we long for water. And the personal authority surrenders to a larger one, which, if it cannot save us from death, can protect us from chaos." So, I want to read it because I think we're dealing with this question about the state reflects what he's saying is that the state reflects the exhaustion of society. And I think the state that possibly Trump, I mean, he doesn't fully represent, but I mean, yeah, okay. So like what the Trump administration represents, at least, it is the exhaustion of the American people who have been assaulted for like at least 80 years in this like in the modern world order. I mean, since the beginning of the Black Freedom Movement and after over the entire of last century. So the exhaustion that we are seeing it's that, but it's also a reflection of like probably this is the most like this is the highest amount of vitality we've seen in white people in the modern in the last what 200 years or something. Like they are like the revolutionary consciousness among white people is probably at the highest now. It's and that's I think that reflects what we are. I mean, it's not perfect. It's not the perfect revolutionary government or whatever be it that we imagine. But I think there's something there that Trump does represent. So yeah, maybe I'll stop there.
Well, I think I agree that basically what the Trump administration and like this new presidency poses is a challenge for basically the democratic capacity of the American people to also rise to a new level, I think, because yeah, like all the executive orders, like I feel like it does take a lot of like thought or like processing to even be like, oh, like what is this? Like, do I believe in like the Constitution or like this part of the Constitution? Like, do I actually believe that like the Supreme Court like has the right to like do this, or like you have to actually think about it, because I feel like the alternative is to just basically like placidly accept what like the leaders haven't, which I feel like also was basically what happened from a lot of the Biden administration, where a lot of people were like, well, like I'm sure they did the best that they could. Like I'm sure that like this complex government, everybody's trying their best. And if Biden like couldn't do the things that like I wanted him to do, then he was just blocked by like these like different whatever, like the different branches, and all of that is like for the best. And I feel like in some ways, like I remember in 2020, people were like, oh, we'll elect Biden and then we'll push him to the left. And I feel like the thing is that if anything, like I think Trump in some ways is more receptive or responsive, or at least is listening, or that relationship between him and the people who made him, I think is a little bit more sensitive in both ways. But basically, I feel like the people, I think, have to also process this and decide, like, yeah, how much of this do I accept? Like, how much of this, like, actually is good for me? And I think not to also, like, now is not a time, I feel like, to get, like, complacent or to be like, oh, like, I'm so glad that, like, Trump is, like, doing all these things. Like, all this chaos is just, like, good because, like, screw the US. Because I feel like the question is, yeah, like for instance with the birthright citizenship, like that executive order, and basically it goes like even up to like the 14th Amendment. And I feel like the question then is like, okay, like do I believe in the 14th Amendment, like the substance of that amendment, or do I believe that so much of it is up to interpretation, that like the 9 Supreme Court justices like deserve to, or like have the right to do whatever they want and interpret over it? And I feel like that also does get to like the question of like, yeah, what was the essence of like, what is the substance or the progressive substance of American history that we've actually achieved and that we've built on over the last like 250 years, from like, yeah, Reconstruction, like the civil rights movement, and what of it is actually like worthy of the people, what of it is a solid enough foundation to like fight for and to actually build on, or like, I feel like the temptation is to say like, it's all bad, all of it has led to like this pain, this carnage, and therefore like throw it all away. And yeah, I think it is really interesting because like the thing of like, oh, like I am the state, I do agree that like in some ways, like there's a way that you can see it and say that it is more democratic than like the previous administration. But I feel like then the question is like, is that a sufficient sustainable form of like American democracy? And like, are we actually satisfied with that? Where like we just need like a Trump figure for the next like however many years. Because I think, yeah, like even this question of like McKinley or Andrew Jackson, I think is pretty interesting, because it's kind of like, what is the essential like legacy of like American history, and what do we actually value? Like what was the peak of America? And is Andrew Jackson like the best president to be like modeling yourself off of? Or like William McKinley? Like, is that the essential vision of like what America is? But I basically do see, I think, Trump's executive orders and his whole approach as a challenge to, yeah, like the establishment or the accepted way of doing things like in the American state that has stood for so long. And obviously, like a lot of the federal courts or like the existing apparatus is going to challenge him and continue to fight him on that. And I feel like that's one fight, but I feel like I'm actually more interested in the struggle between like, yeah, like Trump, like, and then also the people and yeah, like the tech like oligarchs and which side he's actually going to take. Because I think that's also the question of where Trump sees power or how he understands power too. Because I feel like there is a way where he could accomplish some of his stated goals. I think, yeah, but by going all in on like Elon, like Bezos, whatever. Because if those people are willing to throw some of their weight behind him, like he has one layer of protection, right? But then I feel like the balance is like, okay, is he going to betray all of those millions of people who voted for him, who definitely did not vote for him, just because like of the interest of the tech oligarchs? But I think the difficult thing is that, yeah, like interest or like ironically, like with the World Economic Forum and stuff too, like part of the power of Trump is that he's challenging American power. But if he actually succeeds, I think in like the chaos or the instability or like the uncertainty of the future, like for instance, all the stuff with the tariffs or like, I don't know, like the Greenland stuff, like a lot of that could actually like very extremely like weaken, I think, American power or like the American dominance in the world. And so I think it's, yeah, I think it's a question of like where power actually lies and whether it's going to be, yeah, like I guess economic domination, like cutting edge, like technology and like the AI revolution, or if the strength actually is going to be like on the level of the people. And if the strength is in the level of the people, then it's also a question, I think, of the democratic capacity of the people to govern, to challenge, to push, and to actually like make the government serve them. But yeah, I feel like that kind of, there's a lot of maneuvering, I feel.
Well, I thought you did a very nice job. You know, in one sense, and I think this is the essence of what we're looking at. Trump represents, if not in totality, at least in its beginnings, the unmantling of the global architecture that began after World War II.
Yeah.
The whole financial system, the institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the assumption that the dollar was equivalent to gold.
Right.
And then, of course, going off the gold standard completely, and it's just the dollar. All of these mechanisms that have given the United States have created the mechanisms by which the United States empire was hegemonic. And then, of course, as the European nations, one by one or all at once, gradually capitulated to U.S. power and are nothing more than vassal states at this point. Trump is an attack upon that. And you know, so much else is noise. And his major fight is not with China, Russia, Iran, but with the U.S. state. And that is why it is very clear to me that the essence of the Trump project is to bring the state and the bureaucracy of the state to its knees. This is a huge undertaking. And so to talk about Greenland or Panama Canal, that's just noise and distraction. But the essence is other than that, as we have said. And I think you are absolutely right that we have to understand the state, not as it existed in 1917, but its metamorphosis into a far more sophisticated institution manned by millions of people, upwards of 10 million people, if you take all of these bureaucracies and such. So to go after the bureaucrats, in a certain sense, is to go after the state. The bureaucrats enable the state. Now, of course, who is the state? What is the state? And it is a complex, in some ways, undefinable, a set of institutions and networks and individuals. You know, for him to attack John Bolton and to take away his security detail and to do the same with Mike Pompeo is to attack two of the major players within the state. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. And two of the major neocons and war makers. And kind of using them to say to others, this could happen to you. The other thing is the DEI and other things. Is this an attack upon racial equality and non-white men getting positions in government? Or is this an attack upon a crony system that was a veil through which players or agents in various state positions would be elevated, and they would be always beholden to those who put them in those positions. I don't know that I'm making all the sense in the world. But, you know, of course, these instances are still on the fringes of the state. When will the final blow or the final conflict begin? And it will begin if he continues down this road. It is an inevitable struggle. And that is why he is absolutely right to say that I want to meet with Putin, I want to meet with Xi Jinping. We need to have a trilateral summit to make sure war does not break out between us. People make a big thing of him making this man Hexet the Secretary of Defense. The big thing. Well, he doesn't know anything. When he was being confirmed or his hearing to be confirmed by the Senate, he didn't even know what ASEAN was. Well, he's not appointed to know what ASEAN is. His appointment is to operate as a disruptor of that bureaucracy. It is, you know, it's so apparent. And now with Hexet having gotten through, who was the weakest of those behind him, you know, Kash Patel and Tulsi Gabbard will probably be confirmed. And they're in even more sensitive positions to conduct the struggle against the state. I mean, here you have a guy coming in, you know, okay, he's not prepared to do but maybe he is to do the job that he's appointed to do. And as he said, to turn the FBI headquarters into a museum of the deep state. Now, I'm old school from back in the days. You know, I myself, I would argue, was a target of the FBI and COINTELPRO and all this, that, and the other. Why should I shed a single tear for someone that wants to bring the FBI down? I mean, I consider that to be a weakening of the anti-democratic forces, the institutionalized anti-democratic forces. Just one, yeah, I'll just say, you know, I look at a lot of podcasts. It is an addiction, I have to admit. And I'm trying to break it because it does nothing but keep me upset. And, I was listening. I'm not going to name all the names because some of them are friends and previous friends, but I'm listening. You ever hear this guy named Pepe Escobar?
Yeah, I don't know much about him.
Yeah. The worst thing that ever happened to him is for somebody to set up a podcast and put a microphone in his face. He is such a narcissist. And then I don't know whether it's a Portuguese or Greek accent, but some kind of accent. So he must know what he's talking about because he speaks with a foreign accent. That's what we do. Well, in 7 days, they have figured Trump out. And so they know everything that has to be known. They know his strategy, but they don't know who his advisors are, and who are the people who are behind him, who are strategizing with him. But nonetheless, he made the statement, yes, Hillary Clinton was right. The American people are a bag of
Basket of deplorables.
yeah, a state of what they call them?
Deplorable.
Yeah, a bunch of deplorables. I'm saying, wow, you're saying this money at this late date, or you get another friend of mine who says that, the November election was a counter-revolution. And uh,
He said everything was a counter-revolution.
yeah, a counter-revolution, and the white Americans are a settler colony, and all of that mess. And so, what I'm trying to get at is that almost similar to 2017, but I think more virulent. But now the mainstream Democrats have not gone as far as they did, let's say, in 2017, but they have all of these leftists who are whose views are on what we call the lunatic fringe, and many of the people that espouse these views are in fact lunatics and would do well to get mental health treatment. This I get from Brian. He helped me to understand this. Yes, you did. uh, that the American people are settlers, except for black folk, that they are a basket of deplorables, that their major predisposition is not, like Nuri was saying, democracy or democratic, but fascist, and that therefore the American people are the greatest danger to humanity, and that with the election of Trump, they proved or verified all of this. Had they elected Kamala Harris, then they would have confirmed the opposite, that they do have a spark of democratic sentiment. But this wide array of views, and the podcasting is really, it is disproportionately a left, the podcast, although the establishment is recently catching up to them, New York Times and, another, but, and here's what I want to just end on. The ideological struggle is going to get more intense, I think. And I was talking to Crystal. She said it shows the importance of what the free school is doing. All of this back in 2017 of activism, and we're marching, and Antifa is going to protect us from the Nazis. They were saying that over the University of Pennsylvania. And, all of that foolishness is now replaced with an attempt to be more serious, at least ideologically. And I'm interested to see just how, well, for example, you know, I won't name names, some of the communist organizations will respond. What will they say? I'm very interested in how some of the fake schools here in Philadelphia, what are they going to say now? You know, are you going to revert to Cop City? Is that your issue? Is that your cause célèbre? Or are you going to take this moment more seriously? The PSL had, you know, tried to organize a march against Trump. You know what I'm saying? Very interesting. Let me tell you why. I remember in 2017, we had a conference, I think it was on science or something like that. And one of the leaders of the PSL came. Nice guy, smart guy. And he said to us, we will use the liberals. We will use the liberals. And I asked him, well, what prevents the liberals from using you?
Right.
You know, and he didn't answer that. He didn't have to. But the concept of we will use the liberals, I also took to be the opposite. The liberals will find a way to fund and use you. You see what I'm saying? And I would say their behavior at this point, you know, a week ago to, you know, try to organize a demonstration was an example of the mainstream liberals, quote unquote, and the Democratic Party leaders trying to get their heads around the situation, and they don't know what hit them. They could have gone along with Trump winning the presidency, but the Democrats holding on to the Senate and taking back the House. Okay, they could work with that situation. They could work with, well, Trump winning by an electoral college majority, but not a popular majority. Well, Trump swept the table. He did it all. Electoral college, popular vote, took back the Senate, held on to the House, and has a majority on the Supreme Court, which would support his theory. You call it Bonapartism, and it is Bonapartism, named after Napoleon Bonaparte. I am the state, and the state is me. The thing similar to that in US constitutional law or law theory is the unitary executive, where the executive, the president, has almost complete power over the bureaucracy. This is what Trump believes in. That the bureaucracy has thwarted democracy. He's right about that. Now, the people that uphold the bureaucracy will say, well, if you cut the bureaucracy, say health and human service, how are you going to get your Social Security check? You know, that kind of thing. Well, do you need all them people to get your Social Security check?
Right.
Or is it more to this state bureaucracy than them making sure I got my student loan check or whatever? You know, in other words, the bureaucracy is a neutral beneficiary to all of us. What Trump is arguing, this vast bureaucracy is in fact an enemy of the people and thwarts the people. Some people say, well, it's both. But anyway, we do know that the deep state has targeted the people. Has targeted the people. Trump has a case to be made. He was targeted by them. That is not a small case. That is a case that he can make. And then when he pardoned all the 1,600 January 6 people, that was a bold move against the state.
Right.
They said, well, some of them really are committed criminal acts. I'm certain of that. Many of them didn't. But we don't have time to parse out. So we're going to Pardon everybody. Used to be a DJ in Philadelphia named Jack. He used to say, Lottie Dottie and everybody get out of jail. But anyway, let me shut up. I don't want to go there. But but that was a salvo over the bow against the state. They were enemies, alleged enemies of the state. They were attempting to overthrow the government. They were attempting to bring about a coup d'etat, including the leaders of the, what do they call, not the Boogaloo Boys, that's strange in itself. The Proud Boys. But it's a deep thing for a white organization to name themselves the Boogaloo Boys. Y'all don't know what the Boogaloo is, but that's a dance that you did to early funk. But the Proud Boys and the Promise Keepers, and they had long prison terms. So to free them, that was a blow against the state. And with all the talk of Greenland and the Panama Canal, Trump's hands are full with this struggle. And I would argue, and this I agree with you all about this, and of course we have to look at things in totalities. Like I hear people, like the guy we talked about, Brian, well, Trump did this, he did away with DEI, he wants Greenland, he wants Panama, he gonna take Canada as the 51st. That's noise, money. You fell for the hype. The real thing is this clash. And you're right about his inaugural speech. And the visual said it all. Here was Biden. He may not have known what was happening, right? Because he seemed to not be reacting. And so I do know, he's on medication. I'll put it that way. Most legal, but then there might be others. But Kamala Harris did. Dr. Jill Stein did. They knew what this man was saying. Obama did. He attacked them in his inauguration. And inauguration speeches are generally not that. What is the great inauguration speech we remember? John F. Kennedy.
Right.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. That's all you had to know, right? So it's all hype, But this is a cat that talked about substance. That was a substantive speech for the most part. And what he said, all of those people, those presidents on that stage had brought us to a moment where the people had no power, where we are involved in wars and possible wars that we need not be involved in, and that ends today, whether it ends today or not. It was a declaration of war against the state. I think that's what we have to prepare for at this time. And I think it's going to be I agree with you, Jerry. I think, Jerry, somebody said, we have never experienced anything quite like this. A whole regime of power, global and domestic, is being undone. And I'll stop there. I guess the question is what replaces it? That's Nuri's question. And what is the capacity of the people? And that's a big one.
Yeah, and it's like, does, in his own kind of peculiar way, does Trump add to the democratic capacity of the people, or does he present an obstacle to it?
Or is the rupture so great that the people will have very few options but to act,
Right.
to fill the vacuum? Because there will be this power struggle. He declared it in that inauguration, that all these people up here have failed you. That was a hell of a, it was, and that's an indication of, William Butler Yeats, the center could not hold. And so politics will now be played out in the sense of not a consensus of moving to the center to govern, but maybe a lack of governability in the throes of a great struggle over what the state will be and what will be the forces that seize the state. And here, the question of the people comes into play. And I don't have a theory of how that works, to tell you the truth.
Right, because I mean, what you were saying about DI, especially, I mean, this is, and we've been talking about the state of liberalism and moving forward as like what is what the crisis of the West and the Western civilization is a crisis of liberalism. And it seems like today, this whole, like, yes, identity politics, but then this whole infrastructure of DEI, and it's all been manufactured as like in the name of liberalism, first of all, and then the purpose it has served is, on the one hand, yes, to create, like what you were saying, the crony system of people who are going to be loyal to this like this establishment. But at the same time, this is also something that keeps people from moving forward. This is if this system of DEI and so on pretends to be the ultimate arbiter of human freedom, then like that's it.
Right.
There's no moving forward. And so like gutting of all of that is it is the first step that we are that we can, that like people can take to like really define what does it mean to what does it mean, what does being free mean, what does it mean to, what does even like diversity and all of it mean when you're talking about complete conformity with the establishment and the narrative that they've held. And I guess I was thinking of, again, like, to go back, because the anti-Trump movement sort of made like 10 years back onwards, it sort of made this whole infrastructure to be, it really, I don't know, I could be wrong, but to my mind, it really canonized all of this to make it into a system of like the whole DEI and identity politics and so on. And now that it's breaking down, what's happening is that yes, this narrative is not, it's not going to be held by the same props anymore. But that doesn't mean the ruling elite has given up the war on the American people. And so they're also, I think they're also figuring out a new basis to attack Trump.
There's no question. They
And
have to.
yeah,
I think this is the open question, which is part of what's raised by this whole like current, at least like kind of tense coalition between Trump, the Silicon Valley people, and then like his base, because I do think that, like, I guess part of what I've been trying to just make sense of is like, I think the ruling class recognizes like, we can't do the same thing we did in 2017. And like, in part because it would show just like how stupid and illegitimate all of their attacks on Trump were, like, especially with like the whole Russiagate thing, constantly like in the media saying like, oh, like this was a lie, Trump is lying about this and that, and like that whole thing. And I feel like
The big lie.
And like in which doesn't discount like what you guys are saying, which is that like I do think that there's a big fight that is building, and I think will
Jerry, I think
manifests
it's
into-
already been engaged.
Yeah, but I think,
Mhm.
but I guess what I've been trying to make sense of is like, I do think that at the same
Mm.
time, there are parts of the ruling elite which
Mm.
essentially
Mhm.
almost like are like in their own weird way trying to like normalize Trump, or also wishing like almost like they're projecting and like hoping that Trump behaves in a normal way. And it's
Yeah.
like, if we grant you these concessions of like basically like, okay, like this company, like all these companies are going to be essentially rolling back their DEI stuff,
Mm.
and they're spinning like they're ending all these programs. The government is ending all these programs. It's like I feel like my hunch is, or maybe my interpretation is like there are parts of the ruling class which is like, okay, we're going to give you, Trump, certain concessions, especially on the culture war stuff. But as long as you don't attack us in the ways that actually matter, then we're fine with you. Because I think like this is also of like the actual work that I do in like marketing and stuff, which is actually like marketing for like oftentimes like governments, like regional governments, like also for like economic development stuff. And I do think the mood is very different from the first time around, where it's like people basically, it's like, okay, if Trumpism only really boils down to like tariffs and like economic protectionism, like we can live with that. Like we can find a way to adjust that. But I think that's they're essentially in their own thinking, which is like, if Trumpism really is only about like, even if it goes up until like deporting illegal immigrants, like we're fine with that. But if Trumpism actually means like a serious attack on like the state, on these ruling institutions, then like that's the red
Yeah.
line. But I feel like there's this uncertainty about how the ruling class will act, because I think there are parts of the elite who will be like, okay, like let's try to normalize Trump so that then he's less incentivized to actually go really aggressively on what he says he's going to do. And I think that's at least how I'm trying to make sense of like, there is a kind of shifting calculus of how really are trying to kind of address this whole Trump question, because I think that they recognize like they can't do the same thing that they did
Mhm.
the first time around. And part of that is going to be to like basically try to like maneuver Trump to basically be
Right.
less of a threat to the system.
Mhm.
But I don't, that's at least how I'm trying to make sense of it.
But you know, one thing is for certain, forgive me, Adam. One thing is for certain, in 2017, he had no idea how to govern or no idea how to put a government together.
Yeah.
So he had all of these people who were suggested to him who turned out to be enemies of him. How you end up with John Bolton,
Right,
you know,
right, right.
Mike Pompeo,
Right.
these are dangerous neocons, you know. But this time,
Yeah.
he comes
Yeah.
with a set of people who are going to go after his enemies. And I don't think the ruling class, well, I want to put aside the tech giants for a moment, who are allegedly the richest people in the world. We don't know that to be a fact. You know, anybody's, you know, I can claim that I'm one of the richest people in Philadelphia
Right.
because I own a house. But his program is to reindustrialize the country, to get China and Japan and other countries to invest in manufacturing, rather than the neoliberal thing of exporting capital and deindustrialization. However, and this is what I'm going to get to, they have never faced anything like this. No one, least of all a president. Okay, radical left-wingers, let us say, Marxists, Leninists, so-called, and so on, you know, have always talked about the state and we have to seize state power and all of that.
Right, right.
But never a president
Right.
elected by 78 million voters who has taken down the elite of one party and now controls it more or less, saying that my central objective is to seize the state from these anti-democratic, bureaucratic, yada, yada forces. Now, with the tech elites, and I think there were too many of them, I don't know who set that up, you know, but maybe, you know how that goes. By the way, if they had it, you know, in the parade thing outside the White House, all them people couldn't have fit it on the stage anyway.
Mm.
So you wouldn't have to deal with them this way. But
Mm.
what he's talking about is not more AI, because he sided with the Longshoremen's Union. I don't know, did anybody hear about that? Where the longshoremen had gone on strike and they were in a fight with the companies. And one of the big things was not wages so much as the introduction of AI and robots, where about 50% of existing longshore jobs would disappear. And I've taken people here on trips around the waterfront industry in Philadelphia. And when you see that deindustrialization through containerization, and now even the workers who take the containers from the ships, run the cranes and all of that type of thing, and load them onto trucks or whatever, that could all be wiped out. Trump came out and sided with the ILA and stepped to the companies and said, yeah, whatever they said, which at least delayed, if not forestalled, this AI robotics thing, which would have killed the industry and the jobs, would have done away. I just, it's emotional for me because my family was in that industry. But that's Trump's base. AI and Meta and them people, they don't have no base. You know, they just, you know, so-called rich people, and even Elon Musk. Okay, he gave up a lot of cash to Trump's campaign, but he's not central to what Trump is about. In fact, most of them want to get out of the way of that clash that's coming. And it will, I just cannot even begin to imagine it, don't have the words to describe it. We have never seen anything quite like this. And I always talk about the Russian and Chinese Revolution. The Russian Revolution, the Tsar had left. There was no state. So when the Bolsheviks and others came into the Winter Palace, it wasn't like they had to fight there. That's a movie. They walked in. The same thing when the dynasty, the Chinese dynastic system collapsed. You know, Sun Yat-sen and them didn't go, oh, we're going to storm the palace. They just walked in. But this time, we're looking at a serious clash. I mean, something, it's hard to, I don't have the language, but, and this is this is when what you're raising is, that's why sociology is important. What is the democratic capacity of the people? What is the democratic capacity? Because they will be called upon, really, as they rescued Trump in 2024. He was a dead man walking. Think about it. The people rescued him. That's why it's a victory of the people. The only way Trump can survive this clash, the people. And this, well, I'll shut my mouth up.
Well, I think definitely a big question that's coming up from progressive or liberals is that technocrat circle that was, you know, very front and center of Trump's inauguration. But it is a distraction because I think the tech industry is a new phenomenon.
Yes.
Which is, and I contrast it with, for example, the pharmaceutical industry that I'm more familiar with. And even on that end, it's like questions of, okay, now no more communications coming out of the FDA with, what's his name again? RFK Jr. and how like he'll impact the health industry. But honestly, no one cares like in the health industry because they don't really see it as a threat. And some of the, the scare that people, whether it's like you won't get your social security check, you won't get whatever your food stamps, or you won't get medications. It's more of a scare tactic rather than based in actual reality, because at least in the work that I'm in, no one is really bothered by the fact that like there are some few drugs under the Biden administration that were put on a list for being negotiated, but generally the pharma industry is not touched by it. Where like children will still get your medicines, the elderly will still get your medicines, but that's a more longstanding what's the word? Like that's a more long-standing industry. Whereas I feel like that actually even people have less say in, because there's research into it, and then people take whatever medications that they get. But something like the tech industry is actually much more volatile, because something like Twitter, like Facebook, they acquire a user base, and that's even why like Trump is ambivalent about TikTok, because he sees that his platform comes from there as well. That's where the people also get information, and it's also the site of ideological struggle as well. And even with someone like Elon Musk, and then forget Mark Zuckerberg, Trump isn't bending towards them; they are bending towards Trump. And to equate them as in like a new oligarchic power is to just conflate, because they're rich.
I don't think it's because they're rich, but it's because I feel like what was clarifying about the first Trump administration was exactly that, like, all these Silicon Valley companies were in bed with the federal government, and that was the reason why, like, they were essentially like, yeah, they deplatformed Trump. But I think it's not even just because they're rich, but I do think that this, like, the tech stuff does matter, because it's like especially like social, like all the social media stuff, right? This is what essentially shapes people's sense of reality, and this is what shapes people's sense of like you, like literally like what's molding people's consciousness. And I think that's why, like, I don't know, I guess it's not even that I view it more cynically, but I do think that what I'm seeing in like the tech people is maybe an attempt to almost like rescue their own legitimacy by like appear to show that they're on board with Trump. But
I suggest just a small thing on that point. You see, you can set up a Facebook, even a TikTok or X overnight. So Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, I want to put AI aside for a moment. That's what's his name? Altman. Hold off. But the social media companies, see, they could rise and fall overnight because they can be replaced. Like they took Trump off of these social media things. He set up his own. So I agree with Alice. There is a bending towards Trump, but he has not made any commitments to them personally as companies, and they could easily be replaced. But I just want to say that. And I think it's just smear tactics to talk about him as creating a new oligarchy. This is but I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Also wanted to comment on something I've heard that contradicts or like goes in opposition to the oligarchy scare, is that this AI thing is just going to be the next .com bubble, and they're just waiting in the wings to be bailed out when it implodes. And I mean, this is something I've heard more recently, but it would kind of go in line with the idea that they are kowtowing to him rather than he is to them, because they kind of are aware that their whole industry is built on a farce that doesn't actually support itself.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah.
But I think I do feel like part of what is even if it's true that like yeah maybe the social media stuff can be replaced, like I do think that part of what Trump recognizes is like the tech people matter because again like the way that
Right.
even people get
I agree
information
with that.
has changed so much, and like even just like people's consciousness of like what's happening, literally like what's happening in the world that you're living in has changed a lot, especially with the advent of social media. And I think Trump is actually very much in like he feels that very instinctively because that's also like his sense of like where he gets like again like his sense of
Very good.
where he gets his
Yeah.
power from is because like he's really good at social media. Like he's and I think that's also I guess I'm not saying that it's like
Well,
like
that
that.
makes sense,
So
especially if there's this clash with the state, that he is not without allies in the media, because the whole print and cable media is going to be against him.
It's basically then the power of like the tech stuff is not so much their economic function,
Right, yeah.
undergirding or essentially being part of the US economy, but rather more in terms of like the realm of ideological struggle,
I
like
agree with
the
that.
media
I agree
universities
with
and
that.
like
I agree.
social
I
media.
think that's it. I think that's what we're
I feel like
looking
that.
at. I think, I mean, if the thesis that there is this impending struggle for the state and the bureaucracy, if that's what the central struggle will be, putting aside Israel, Russia, Ukraine, all of that, then I agree that he will need his media, and that doesn't mean they will support him ultimately.
yeah, right.
Mhm.
I do think, at least in the realm of technology, there is a realm of thought that if we can make new technological innovations, we can technology ourselves out of this crisis, which I think is part of the idea of the 500 billion Project Stargate funding, which people are actually tech people are actually not excited about. They've been humbled by a new Chinese AI model, which was trained on like very small amount of money. What I take away from his relationship to those tech people, or even things like DEI, is pretty much as you said, Jeremiah, in making a bold move. Let's say canceling the DEI, for example, is putting the question on the table, like, is this of service to the people of America? And I mean, a question that we have grappled with from the documentary that I think encapsulates the like totality of the questions that I think even Trump people are thinking about in their own way, in their own words, is, has white modernity liberated the whole of humanity, and has it even liberated white people across the different spheres of life? With I think right now represented with executive orders. Uh, a big thing, at least just because I have a lot of family, that immigration has this system freed. Has it? I want to even talk about, has this even like freed you, my immigrant family? Has it freed uh, your country in Mexico, your family in Mexico? Has it even freed you and your children here in this country? And does this make the American people more free? Whether you're going to succeed in taking down, let's say, like Department of Education, it's hard to say. Suppose he doesn't. Suppose he does. Like, does the American education system, as it exists right now, or in upending it, does this actually like educate your children so that they're capable of essentially really thinking for themselves and making a worthwhile life with agency? So I do have the sense that people don't have the same exact hysteria against Trump that makes it possible to actually think about what he's doing. And with this more level-headedness, and the fact that, suppose Trump is actually able to do everything that he claims he's going to do, it's not like you could completely transform the country in 4 years. Can the American people think in new ways in trying to address the challenges that Trump is addressing in his changes, whether successfully or not, are the people themselves able to engage with these in a new creative way and in a way that is democratic. That would be like my ultimate goal for the Trump presidency. Of course, I want him to be the president of peace. I want him to succeed in dismantling the deep state, which once again, I'd be very happy if he did it in 4 years. But can the people, the American people themselves, think about their governance and the state in a clearer way so that we can actually have a new future in this country?
The only thing, if I could just say, because in a lot of ways it is, can we just here sitting on this day imagine what an intense clash over who will control the state might look like? I think it's something the likes of which this nation has not seen before. And, you know, it will consume, the way I imagine, it will consume the nation and the people, will force people to make decisions and choices they don't want to and never had to make. You know, and this gets back to, you know, when James Lawson was here, and we talked about, does the nonviolent theory have a theory of the state? You know what I'm saying? I would hope that it would be a gradual, peaceful kind of reconciliation, a transfer of power and authority, at least part of it. But there's no doubt. I just think the probabilities are on the side of something not so nice and not so pretty and not so neat.
Just the only thing I thought that was interesting when you had said that a big clash has already been engaged and like
I think it has. At the, you know, the initial, I don't know, Jerry, if you would agree, the initial and the inaugural speech, the inauguration could be viewed as the beginning shots that he fired.
I mean, I think especially the executive orders. Like, no, I don't think any president has signed 26 executive orders literally on day one of the presidency. Yeah. He was promising to sign like hundreds, actually sign hundreds more.
no, I'm just interested about what you're saying about the declaration of war against the state, and what you're saying is the stage of history that we're dealing with that also hasn't occurred in prior revolutionary moments, whether that be in China or Russia. Because it seems like you're also saying that like the takeover of power happened differently than what's happening right now. Which I find interesting. I don't know how you go more into that, like, or like, I just feel like we or a party aren't, we as in either the people or, for example, a party isn't just about to walk into the White House. Or, for example, I don't think the January 6th or Proud Boys or Blue Boys have power to control the government. And I think that the government and what you're pointing out about the bureaucracy is also a different complex than has arisen before because of the nature of neoliberalism or the, I don't know how you would call the state that we currently have.
That's a very
Because then you're also saying like, well, this transition of power, I'm interested in that. I'm interested in what you're trying to explain would be that transition, or a clash or like,
Because I don't know if it'll even be like a single transition, because I think this is part of the like it could end in like a really dramatic conflict, but I think it's also, even if there is like a big dramatic conflict between Trump and his people and the state, I feel like it makes more sense to actually see, if we're looking at it also in the lens of like an actual revolution in the United States,
Yeah.
that's something which doesn't take place in like one single conflict and then it's over. But like even like, especially even like the civil rights movement, it's something that like always proceeds in stages. And it's like one stage leads to another, like it creates more possibilities for.
And this is
Yeah.
why the presence of Steve Bannon remains very important. Because he does claim to be a Leninist and a revolutionary. You know what I'm saying? And he does, at least, whatever he means, but he does say that his objective is to seize state power. You know what I'm saying? So, what Joe had to say.
Can you give us a comparison contract difference between Gallup and we all? Not completely total town. I think it's ridiculous shit wrong. In the fact that wasn't answering the point. You don't need to do wrong. So if you could do that.
Yeah, I cannot because I haven't thought about it, but I see where you're going with it. For people that don't know, Huey Long was the governor of Louisiana back when Louisiana barely had a government and was a racially segregated state, brutally racially segregated, but it was a poor, poor state, maybe the poorest, second only to Mississippi.
And quite astonishing because he was able to win over hearts. And he was bringing four black people, four white people.
Absolutely.
They should have the whole country. They should have the country.
Yes.
So,
Accomplishments.
Huey P. Newton was named after him. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. His family is from Louisiana.
oh, shit.
Good. What you want to say?
well, I was thinking, particularly Jeremiah brought up the moral high ground, the moral effect. And I'm thinking about the conflict of the time, and I'm also thinking about Locke and Aristotle. They talk about extremes and this empathy for the immigrant, the extreme, and the dislike for the immigrant in the extreme, dislike. And I'm thinking that Trump represents a sort of a middle ground. And the people, and as you said, the people are feeling his he has a grasp of the American people's conflict. Even with the question of gender, I'm raising moral questions. Remember he signed that thing about you mark either you're male or female? Well, the extreme left would be he and the she, and the right would be we don't like, we're against gay. So he sort of captured the ideal of the people, and the people who don't like him see him as moving, like he doesn't like gays, he doesn't like black, but he contradicts that by having blacks in his administration, by having the Mississippi Valley people perform. So he does represent, and I'm thinking philosophy, he's his antithesis, he's sort of the antithesis of certain things that is happening. And it's almost, if you want to look at Hegel, it's sort of a movement of a new synthesis.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I'm just talking about philosophy, how that comes into play. So after Trump, there's going to be an antithesis to Trump. And so you can see how that is sort of a movement. That's how I see it. just like the border. Even the extreme, letting people come in versus protecting the border. So he sort of has that pulse of the people. And the other thing, you don't see the rise of black people really going against him so much, which is interesting. I mean, there's like really say, hey, there's an element, but there's not just like when we went to the Trump rally in Philadelphia, in North Philly. If this was 1960, you would have masses of black people out there protesting. But in 2024, it wasn't.
There's probably more
So,
black people in the Trump rally than black people protesting against Trump in North Philly.
and so that says something.
Because I also think on the immigration thing and this whole thing of like the moral high ground, always the kind of like the almost like the ideological thing that I think a lot of like liberals and progressives have done with this immigration question is basically to like treat these immigrants and migrants as like they're just victims, and it's almost like the immigrants themselves like don't have any agency at all. Like people who come to this country don't have any agency, and as like children of immigrants, as many of us are here, like I think that's complete BS because it's like it's not that you even have to like vilify everyone who comes to the US, but like this whole thing of basically being like, oh, like we have the moral high ground, like we're gonna welcome everyone who comes to America and all that stuff. Like it's like it does remove the agency actually from the people who do come here. And it's like I think speaking as like a children of immigrants, it's like many people who come to America are not actually that interested in like really contributing to this country. They're coming here because like, yeah, there's more opportunity here. At least there's the kind of the selling of America as like this land of opportunity. And it's like, I don't know if actually many immigrants like really have any sense of responsibility for this country. And so like I do think this immigration thing is going to be very ugly. And there's going to be a lot of like controversial things that happen. And like, I don't really feel comfortable with everything that Trump is saying, but this like that like I feel like part of the whole equation which had been so dominant during the first Trump administration of like we're liberal, like we care about immigrants and like they're all victims, like that whole thing, like I think that has run itself out. And like there actually should be questions like, okay, like you come to this country, like all of us, like yeah, all of us who've like come here, it's like we came to this country, like there's nothing in this society that actually would prepare you to even want to take responsibility for America. And so like that should be a question that's posed to people who are children of immigrants or immigrants who came here. And like it's not that like I agree with like this whole, especially I guess like the optics of like mass arresting people and sending them on planes and stuff. But I think this whole kind of liberal kind of piety around the whole immigration question, I think that's run itself out. And I think that's part of the reason why like there are some, I guess like people on the left and like all these also all these nonprofits, which are kind of just like this what we describe as like the whole of society approach to governing society. Like there are, I guess, like resistance to like the whole mass deportation thing, but I think it doesn't have, like again, it doesn't have the kind of the appearance of moral legitimacy that I think it had during the first Trump administration. And I think the questions become much more stark and much more actually honest this time around.
People really try to take the moral high ground as if deportation is like, the end of your life, a death sentence. I have had a couple of uncles get deported. I've seen them in Mexico, all right, their life is not as materially prosperous, but they're doing okay, man. I'm gonna be honest with you. I think most people will live to see another day. I know it was a disruption to my family's life here, and yes, they had more opportunity here, but they live to see another day. Honestly, man, at least on my own, they look a little bit more at peace in Mexico than here, dog. I'm gonna be 100 with you. At least my family. I hope other people's family is doing a little better. And that moral high ground. Honestly, then I start to get mad when I think about people not having that same fervor towards war.
Yeah.
Like I said, I'm gonna see my uncle in July, man. I'm looking forward to seeing him. But how many children have been bombed. How many mothers have been looking through the wreckage for their children and they didn't find them?
That's why I think it's more about the state, like the crisis of the state, like you were saying. Like I know that there's gonna be different moments as time progresses. Like I'm not really quite saying that there's just one or the other. One moment that we're in now, there's another moment that will become. But I'm more interested on locating exactly where we're at, or at least it seems to me that's what we're putting on the table. Like I don't think, for example, I can use philosophy in a programmatic or like certain like X equal function way to be like, because this happened, then logically something is supposed to happen. I'm more interested on what's happening and I'm more interested on not trying to assume I can see what can happen because of what has happened before. For example, I don't know exactly, I can't say particularly that Trump is a antithesis to anything because I don't really know what it is. You know, I feel like we're trying to locate, at least for me, like what Trump is first before I feel like there is a thesis, synthesis, or antithesis situation. For example, I'm saying that like to your point about philosophy, it's kind of dead because I don't want to use philosophy in a function way. I want to use philosophy in order to think, to understand stuff. But like, that's why I thought that was interesting on like, well, what you're pointing out about the fight that's already been engaged, or like, I thought like this clash with the state, and then questions that we have about the democratic capacities of people, or because that's a very generic way, in my opinion, to say something. You were mentioning if there is a rupture, then what can be, or how can people take positions in such a situation? Especially, I think it is important to kind of understand better the mechanics of a state that it has become itself to, like you're saying, either impose more war or become a major superpower in a way that it can't exist properly in a world that is also in a changing, as in terms of power. Like the power is not within the American dollar, within the military apparatus, or like whatever, however to explain the amount of value that is not in America in that sense. But like, I'm interested to know how Trump is is what direction, I guess to say, that Trump is going for, what he understands, whether it be because of like we're saying, because he's American, or because of social media. But there is a certain like, I don't know how to explain like what you brought to the table, because I feel like it is important that Elon knows that he's not playing a role in government and or even maybe popular opinion, but he or the technocrats have a certain idea about society, but it's also up to the people. Like I feel like it's more up to the people to decide if that society will exist or not, because also Trump is beholden to the people, or Trump, that relationship that was concretized, whether that be in 2017 or the following years, like means that Trump has a different responsibility to decide upon, like his decisions.
Could I say something? You know, why would he use language during the campaign? I am your revenge. I am your retribution. That's, I mean, that is not language that you normally equate with a presidential campaign. So I'm running for president to get revenge on those who have harmed you.
Yeah.
And I think that is, I mean, that language is so much like, I mean, you'd have to say like warfare, like conflict. So that's why, I would say, like they say, we must keep our eyes on the prize. What is the essential conflict
Yeah.
between him and those who,
Well, because I think it's also like, I guess I was trying to say this in the beginning, but I don't know if there's ever been an American president whose the legitimacy that he derives in the eyes of the people is
Absolutely.
exactly based off of how far he can go against the system and how
absolutely.
much he can attack
There never has been.
and how much he can attack
Never.
basically the government and the state.
Mhm.
And whether or not you think that he can do it, like I think that historical strange fact itself is like it's its own, it presents its own questions about essentially where the American people are at. And I think I guess part of how I understand, we use these words of like the battle of ideas. We talk about like these grand words of like epistemology, like all that stuff. I actually do think that like even with this conversation, part of the fight amongst the American people is even fighting for like, okay, can the people come together and have a shared sense of like what is even happening in the country? Because I think that that is one of the strongest weapons that the ruling class still has, which is basically to like shatter and disperse and to basically make people confused about like what's happening. And this is also why like I guess
And they've shot their best with the wokeism. I mean, that was their best hand to divide the people.
Right.
They played that and it didn't work. It worked for a while. But
And so I think that's part of the battle that we engage in too, is like to actually like, especially like the face-to-face thing, you like actually need to bring people together, be like, okay, like this is your theory of what's happening in the world. Okay, like let's actually talk it out. Let's actually talk through it, because I think that's if there are things that prevent the capacity of the people to struggle, it is exactly that, like there's like still an absence of like a completely shared sense of reality, even if the people have rejected psychologically like the ruling class, but like there's still not a common foundation of like, okay, like we actually fully have a shared sense of like what's happening in the country and therefore what the possibilities are. So I think that's part of the battle that we see, which is also like, like why we meet every week and like talk through stuff constantly. It's not talking for the sake of talking, but like literally because there is a struggle to even have a sense of like, like this is what reality is. And we can share that.
One thing I want to agree with you when you said he was like the common man. When you was watching, he went to California and sat around that table, and I was watching. He was talking about bureaucracy. He talked against FEMA.
He talks against
FEMA. He criticized FEMA. And he was speaking, he said, why do we need all this bureaucracy to build a house? All this red tape. So he was talking, in what you were talking about, he contradicts the state, how they run things. He's running it almost like a businessman, say, I want to get this done. I want to get rid of all this paperwork. And that's what people want to hear. Because there is a lot of bureaucracy. When you're going to school for scholarships, a whole lot. And and like you pointed out, that he has a pulse on the people more say. And I think that's correct. And the manifestation of that was his talk in California about rebuilding the lot of people who had that fire.
I would agree. I would say this, that he criticizes the bureaucracy as the first step to go against the state. I can, whoever said, I think Sarah, somebody said it. This is huge. This is huge. It will, the potential to divide the people is very present because people will be confused. They're already confused, and this, of course, raises the question of the left. And, we talk about these left podcasts and so on. I guess although I'm addicted to them, I have to say that perhaps I've benefited from them because you see in ways that I hadn't seen before the breadth of opinion, and then you can try, like to categorize, and there is a fringe, an absurd, even mentally ill group who could just talk. And so I guess we'll learn something about what some opinion makers are saying. I take a deep breath because this is something like, I agree with you, we've never seen this, but we've never seen a man elected to the highest office in the country who ran against the government. This idea of the vital center is not just a word or a concept. It is a governing principle. Especially after World War II. Republican, Democrat, okay, we can fight it out electorally. But after the election, we come to the center in order to govern. And the word govern. Suppose there is no center. Can there be government? I mean, all of these questions are before us. I think Sarah said it's exciting, but also I find it breathtaking. Also, a bit scary. I think that which protects us is our struggle for ideological clarity.
Well, I think this emphasis on the people is really important because in several free schools ago, you also mentioned how the American people as a geostrategic force.
Oh, yes.
And because while it's important to understand, what is happening in the world in like the struggle of great powers or, what's happening in national politics, Trump also shows that he didn't kind of just appear out of nowhere. The people, if you study the people closely, the things that he's talking about and running about are what people have been talking about or feeling at least for decades, where they feel not heard, where they feel that the government doesn't serve them, where they feel that immigration is a problem, especially in these cities. And so when you guys were talking, I was listening and the word harbinger came up, where if you study the people closely enough, I think there are a lot of questions of where Trump will go. But the people can be a reflection of where he will go. Because in this declaration of war, he can't survive on his own. If the people abandon him, then that's not he won't have that ammunition essentially to go against the state. And I think
they'll just assassinate him.
Yeah. And the only reason why he's come, having run, been president for a term, and then still get this mass support or still be able to run and be successful is because he still had the support of the people. And I think it is going to be tough in terms of, there's not a united, I think what Jeremiah, you were saying before, a united shared sense of what is going on, what is the way forward. But at the same time, or what was I going to say? It's a dialectic in that people, there's all these forces occurring on the people. And I think the question was raised earlier too, which is how does Trump affect the capacity of the people? But then there's the opposite of the end of the dialectic, which is how will the people step up or not? And
This is just so uncertain.
I guess I say this all to say that preschool is on, we're trying to understand the forces that are happening on people. We're also trying to understand people, both from a moral sense, but also that they do foretell what is to come.
Yes, I agree with that.
Like if we go into civil war, if we go into dark winter, it all depends on if people still have like the consciousness and the capacity of the people to struggle. And I think those are the questions that we're asking, which is, someone like Trump, I described him as a poor white. But the thing is, I actually realized he's the poor white that has come after the civil rights movement. And the question is, how much has America, even though unconscious of it, has benefited from the revolutions that have happened in the past? And based on the revolutions of the past, do they have it to move forward? And what is school's role too? In understanding and working through these ideas as they're so confusing, which is why I really appreciate this conversation, because and your accounts of it, because so much happened this past week, and you're like, what's important? What's a distraction?
I think Trump is doing that deliberately too.
Right.
Like I think he's trying to confuse people.
I think
To
so.
be honest.
Yeah, and it needed a conversation for us to be like, yeah, what's out of this past week? What is actually important, and what do
Right.
we stay on post with?
Right, right.
Uh,
Mhm.
yeah.
Because, you're right. I agree with you, Chair. I just want to underline it, to overwhelm the media landscape, because he knows they're going to react in certain ways, predictable ways. So just throw everything at them and keep them react and keep them on the back foot,
Yeah.
It's an interesting media strategy, I think.
Because I think the question that I've been trying to wrap my head around is like, okay, if we can say that Trump has in his own way kind of declared war on the deep state,
And they on him.
but why does the reaction from the deep state it's not as like, it doesn't feel at the same level as what I feel like we experienced in 2017.
I'm sorry.
And maybe I could be wrong about this also, but I think it's partially, I guess I was trying to say is that part of it is that I do think that they've exhausted so many different ways of trying to attack Trump. And it's like, you can keep trying to do the same thing, but he's already shown like he's almost immune to a lot of it. But that too, it's that I think that the ruling elite, in part because they've been dealt essentially a strategic blow and a strategic defeat, I think they are scared of him. And I think they're scared that if they go too far and essentially trying to like, if like you assassinate Trump, like, or if you do something like that, I think they, like, again, like January 6th is like only a very small, like, inkling of like what the kind of anger and the kind of visceral response.
I agree with
and I think that's why, even though like obviously there is this great battle that is brewing, I do think that part of the reason why there's like, I almost feel like there's more caution in some ways from parts of the ruling class, is because I think that they're actually like, oh shit, like if we move in a certain way, like it's almost like their confidence has been shaken, and it's like they're scared of what the people might do. That's
I agree with you. I agree, but there's always a quiet before the storm.
Right.
And this is kind of a quiet. And remember, we talked about the state is not just the blunt force, but the ideological function of the state. However, they have to be, and I agree with you here, they have to be very careful in how they deploy blunt force.
And
if they will. They understand the stakes. I think if I were to, make a measure of Trump, I think that he is prepared to stare them down. I don't think he's afraid of them. I think he's accepted in a certain sense his fate. And when he said at the inauguration that he was shot in the ear and God saved him because he had to save the nation.
Right.
Well, you can read it as a deranged man, or you can read it as a person acknowledging this is his destiny, and he will carry it through. I think I think the state I think they understand the
What the
stakes, the
drama, yeah.
consequences, and I think we're you hear I don't know.
Right. And I mean, like the last 4 years has sort of like the fact of the existence of the deep state is something I think even 4 years back, this was one of those things that people would like debate about.
Right.
But I think now we have come to the place where we've seen that, okay, like the presidency means nothing. It is ultimately like the last 4 years of the Biden presidency ultimately was, I mean, yeah, like were these his decisions? And like, so now with Trump where he is now, I think the ruling, like going back to what Jeremiah was saying, yeah, the ruling class obviously wants to like portray as much of, oh yeah, Trump is in charge, there's not as much pushback, and so we have to be cautious about how far can we afford to show that Trump is, he is under attack from us. He's under attack from everything that is good for during his campaign. We're not like we can't attack all of that at once.
No, and 77 million voters.
Right.
That's one of the values of a electoral democracy, because it is a way to measure where the people are and all the polling. So it's good from a social science point of view. That's 78 million votes. And then the fact that he penetrated into areas of the country that Republicans or a Republican had never done. I think that they have to be very, very careful in this. And in a certain sense, I think they're fighting off of their back foot.
Yeah.
They're not fighting going
No.
forward. They can't, I agree.
Yeah.
They find it difficult to assume an offensive. That's why they need this fake left to keep biting at the edges, talking shit on YouTube and that type of thing until they,
Right.
the real forces, get themselves together. Because when they come at him, they can't make a mistake. They can't do like the boy up in Butler and miss. They have to, it has to be well planned. And now it's just, small stuff, different so-called intellectuals of the left talking trash all the time. But then when they come, they have to come. Now, it's only been a week. When they come, they have to come right, and they can't miss.
And to verify what you're saying, you remember, Jeremiah, you said the resistance is weakening. You said that at the beginning. You said that the resistance to Trump is weakening.
Yeah.
And that's verifiable in the media. With MSNBC, all these, as you described, they're backing up and not coming forward. Backup. I mean, these are all concrete manifestations of what you're saying.
And if you pay attention, I don't know how many of y'all listen to cable news and especially MSNBC and CNN. MSNBC had gone buck wild crazy during the election. I mean, it wasn't even a news channel. It was a part of the Biden campaign, and they were ruthless. And then he went. They even had to bring Rachel Maddow back. I don't know, y'all don't. I'm looking at Michelle. You don't know who Rachel Maddow is. Well, I have many addictions. And one of them is cable news. I'm not on drugs. I don't drink alcohol.
Not like that.
Sorry. Sorry. But MSNBC, which is it is Comcast, and it is it's the cable news wing of NBC. You know, NBC National Broadcast, one of the legacies of the news of television. And then when they went to cable, they had a spinoff called MSNBC. And their top people, like the Joe Scarborough show in the morning with his wife, Mika Brzezinski, the daughter of Zbigniew Brzezinski, and they act like that's a great thing. But anyway, each of them, their husband and wife, they each were making $10 million a year. And Rachel Maddow, who is probably the strongest voice, strongest, thinker on cable news. She's a beast. And so she had retired some time ago and was doing, only special. They had to bring her back, at a reduced salary. Not that she's making 20 million a year, so they took her down to 18. She's still strong. And but I'm just saying, their media strategy, which is cable news in particular, and you're right, they may have been blocked in social media. Trump's alliance may have blocked that avenue. So the question is, how do they then pursue their propaganda thing? And propaganda is very important. And the authority and acceptability of the host. Oh, and now CNN. We all remember CNN. It announced that it's laying off 200 people. That's a lot. And they're going in another direction. But, I agree with you that the media no longer has a hold over the people that it did. People don't look at it. It is a very profound environment, but you have to understand that's what Serafina said. What is the environment? What is the struggle? So, they're going to smear Trump, and Trump is going to have his own approach, inundate the environment with all kinds of noise, allow them to distract themselves, oh, he took away DEI.
Right.
He's going to try to write the 14th Amendment to the Constitution.
Right.
Oh, we've just discovered he's down with the oligarchs.
Right.
He said he's going to do this with Putin, and Putin said every day is some other. Come on, give me a break. It's only 1 week, man. And they got people going on this roller coaster.
I feel like I've been on the roller coaster.
Oh, you've been on that? Get off that roller coaster. Anyway, because the real deal, and that's where all the work will be. So I say that, get off that roller coaster. I'm addicted, but I'm not on the roller coaster. I might be on the roller coaster.
Like even like this whole DEI thing, I feel like a lot of like academics are very worried about the whole like ending the DEI program.
Well, they're worried about the shutdown of the university.
And because it's also like all these there's all these administrators in the universities who don't do anything, but they all have like diversity titles, all that stuff. But I think part of it is like because part of the strategy with the whole DEI.
You remember y'all got Asian studies at Cornell?
Yeah.
And then they kick y'all to the curb after they.
Once we were no longer in school.
Remember that? And then they hired. They didn't even ask y'all, did they?
No. Well,
They were asked, but they didn't care.
They asked.
But I feel like all the DEI and like woke stuff emerged as a reaction to Trump. But the whole especially the whole media strategy was to basically try to beat people over the head 24/7. Like Trump is a racist, Trump is a fascist, like Trump is a racist.
Mhm.
And it's like you saw it, you had the hubris to think that if you just kept hammering people with that message, that then you could discipline the people into basically like essentially like seeing the world that in the way that you do.
Mhm.
But I think part of like the unique political like I don't know, physics of Trump is that like the more you attack him, the stronger he gets.
Well, this is oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
This is unusual.
yeah, it's like very
They were
unusual.
supposed to have won this one.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, but I think it's also like all these, because it is really funny, like all these companies that are basically like kind of quietly ending their DEI programs.
Yeah.
On the one hand, like maybe like woke people would be like, oh no, like this is terrible. Like I feel like it shows just how empty all of it was. Like how like it didn't actually mean anything. And like it was very easy actually for all these companies to be like, oh, like we are supporting like black, trans, whatever. But then it's like it actually didn't mean anything. And the fact that they can just like quietly end it like that shows how much of it didn't mean anything. And I mean,
It showed how superficial the whole woke thing was. It was, virtue signaling more than it had any substance to the struggle to end inequality. So it's, I guess, one election and one inauguration ended a lot of BS. It just ended, and nobody without a bang, but with a whimper.
yeah.
Nobody makes a big thing of it. Didn't help nobody anyway, help it. That kind of attitude.
Comments?
Oh, you want to do
Want to do comments?
Yeah, I can look on that. Okay, Bambala, Nez, Pertina says hello, good morning. And Sparks says Doc killed it once again on the Garland Nixon show. Todd said good morning. Someone named Robo Reina asked, where does the party take place?
Where does what?
Where are we? We're at the Church of the Crucifixion. Bumbleye said, I would only go so far as to say that Trump could be a useful idiot at best. Todd says, China just made all of their far more powerful AI open source. Matt says, it seems pretty astonishing to make definitive assessments of Trump at this point. Wisdom Leaf says, how? The man's like 80 years old. We need him to die first. But then Matt clarified, it's astonishing to make assessments of what the second Trump presidency really is intentional about being, given that it's been, like 1 week. Bambla says, AI can be dangerous when or now or if it's broken away from the binary system. Instead of yes or no, it could be yes, no, maybe, and self-destruct, but with a joking smiley face. They also say America is also dependent on the rest of the world. And with a joking smiley face. And then said, but there is no mention of the suffering of Palestinians at the inauguration. Todd said, Nick from Revolutionary Blackout dismisses all MAGA working people, read white, as irredeemable.
Really?
I guess so.
Yeah, I saw that on Twitter.
You said Wyatt?
Could you read that they say?
Well, I think this is like paraphrasing, but Todd's assessment is that they are dismissing all MAGA working people, which is like code for just, I guess, white people.
Yeah, this is a guy from the Revolutionary Blackout now.
Okay, and then Matt says, pardoning January 6th participants does not amount to declaring war on the state compared to, say, closing overseas military bases. And then Bambala on the lack of acknowledgement of Palestine at the inauguration. Yes, and they paraded these healthy hostages and had a grand Zionistic heyday. I thought it to be disgraceful. Magna says, Doc once referred to deportation as repatriation, which I think is poignant. Liberal hysteria hides that immigration is the safety valve of empire and a weapon against the anti-colonial struggle. Todd says, Pepe Escobar is the wacko that alleged that Russia shut down an Israeli jet before it could drop a nuke. He's lost all of his very limited credibility. And Babla is talking about the two-party system, where they always say that one's always better than the other. And then I'll read Chantanu's. Oh, and then Todd says that the CPUSA is also suggesting that Trump actually has no mandate to govern. and that they are diminishing his electoral victory by saying that he won only in the margins.
Could I, wait a minute, who's saying that now?
Todd saying that CQSA is saying that.
See, that he owned,
That he only won in the margins.
Like a small margin.
yeah, I'm trying to.
That even though he won, I guess, like the electoral vote as well as the popular vote, that margin is like still slim enough that it doesn't mean anything, I guess. I don't know. I'm kidding. Okay, and then let's see. Shantanu says, well, about the whole Greenland issue, it's funny because Denmark is a US vassal state, which has historically been extremely committed to the US, even over the EU. They're a founding member of NATO, participated in the US-led military operations, and have agreed to host a US military base in Greenland. What does it say when Trump says he's going to annex 98% of their territory? It might be a distraction, but it might also be a message to the EU and other NATO forces that he's not their ally anymore. And then he says, my advisor will be out of a job once they crack down on DEI. I'm sensing some happiness in that comment.
Oh, wow.
BK says, we also may be witnessing deep state infighting or disputing over the best course to arrive at common outcomes. Either way, they both understand that the subjugation of the masses is imperative. And then Bambala says, kick out those who may need help. And then M. Sparks is asking Todd, are you sure about that regarding Revolutionary Blackout Network? And
I've seen the I feel like, yeah, because one of the big questions is Trump just one part of the ruling class? And does Trump represent a fight within the ruling class? And I feel like that's a way of looking at it that has been offered many times before. And I guess the way that we see it is, like, even if Trump is like a millionaire, a billionaire, like even if he has like all these tech people also temporarily, at least by his, like in his camp, like really what makes Trump, like we've been saying in this discussion, is like what makes Trump is his movement. Like that's what makes him any kind of like political figure at all. It's not the fact that he's part of the ruling class, but the fact that like he has been able to actually channel a movement and keep that movement going basically for like a decade.
Yeah, and you know, people who make that argument do not understand the American political system or the American party system. They don't understand that simplistic. Well, they're both the same. Well, you could, I mean, the better argument, if they want to make it, is that they have tended to be about the same up till now.
Right.
And that is why the whole question of the center is so important, because they are the same when they agree to govern from a center. But when the center has collapsed and government, well, I don't want, but there is no, so how do they govern? They are not, if they were the same, they could find a center from which to govern. They can't find it. It can't be established. I mean, that's you know, some arguments are just infantile and childish and just based upon what I heard somebody say that, and I'm going to say it, and that makes more sense to me. I don't have, and see this other thing of, I don't feel like thinking, I don't want to think, so let me just say what I heard. And people that make that argument don't understand it too. They don't understand the American political system, the state system, and nobody understands it perfectly, but they have no idea what's going on. And you know, I know Chris Hedges had that position, and he's a very smart man in many ways, but in other ways, he's not so smart.
Well, I thought that was one of the big things. I didn't say much last free school, but I remember when I reflect back, look at the notes from last week, like, I don't think anyone had ever explained to me basically the concept that like there is such a thing as a two-party system, but
they're coalitions and that they
Yes.
rule ultimately from the center once the
Yes,
election is won.
absolutely.
And that was just really clarifying because I think I didn't realize how important that was until it just gives you the clarity to say that Trump is a new phenomenon.
No,
It's
no
not
question.
some sort of like, oh, like
Mhm.
Democrat,
Mhm.
Republican, they're the same, which I felt like I saw so much through the election as well, because it's
Yes.
so, you're not able to see what's new about Trump. And I feel like that's what's helpful. That's what's been really, I think, clarifying about this discussion, because I know I was on a roller coaster this week, but
Did you get off it?
well,
You go get back on it when you go.
I feel- but what was helpful, yeah, no, it's because I think there was so much uncertainty in the air, and there is so much to try to take in. That is why, yeah, I felt like once we started really just talking and hearing, like, you know, Jeremiah again, like laying everything out and like seeing it, like instead of all like being able to separate, I think a lot of the noise from like actually what's happening, and also
Mhm.
when we recenter the people, because I know that in our reading group this week, for example, like Lucian Blackwell, I think, and other people are having a lot of different reactions to Trump, but then also what's important is that like precisely it is like the people who also must like be reminded of their capacity for deciding the direction of this country. And in fact, that like that's what the election proved, that there was no Trump victory without the people dealing a blow to the ruling elite. And I think that I just, you don't want that spirit to be lost, especially in this time. And especially, I think it's just, I mean, maybe I'm also not piecing all of this together yet, but I know it's what, like, you know, with the last like 1 month of like the year of Baldwin, for example, but also what we're doing in like 2025 and in the free school, this is, I think, part of that task in terms of, what it means for the ideological struggle, but also the struggle that the American people must wage and be prepared for, because there are many ways in which the people may not feel entirely prepared for this, or may not feel entirely ready to take, but they have to, just as you were saying that like the ruling elite has like, you know, the next time they take aim, they have to be very, very precise. It's not too different than how I think the American people need to be positioned to take this, because there's a lot of ways it sounds like it could kind of go down.
May I just expand upon something you're saying? Because this question of what is the American two-party system and how do the two parties govern? How is the country governed? These are, I mean, you know, to be for real about it, you know, even people with PhDs in political science don't know it, don't know this. Or at least they act like they don't know it. I presume they don't. And, you know, that's why, you know, I compared it to the Chinese one-party system. And I said, their similarity is that the Chinese Communist Party is a coalition. It's not just the leadership, let's say Xi Jinping, they're socialists or Marxist Leninists with Chinese characteristics, which I read not, you know, Marxist Leninists with Chinese DEI. When they say what they're saying is we're Marxist Leninists committed to solving Chinese problems. You know, we're not based upon some general theory of everything. You know, we have to solve the problems of China, which they've done quite well at doing. But it's a coalition. There are all kind of political forces in China, in the Chinese Communist Party. Like I said, they're Maoists, they're liberals, they're social democrats, they're Marxist Leninists, you know, and a consensus must be built. And that's what the Chinese communists, Xi Jinping and them in particular, maybe Deng Xiaoping era too, that unlike the Maoist era, the Communist Party cannot rule as a blunt instrument against all of those who disagree with them. You know, so when Don talked about opening up, he was talking about a more discursive situation. Now, Mao, I want to say this. Mao had this statement. You know, Mao was a poet at the end of the day. And who was I talking with? Oh, me and Albert were talking yesterday, trying to understand. I was telling him about the China conference and how we spent hours trying to understand Mao. You know, this brilliant, genius, courageous force who effed up at the end of his life. But Mao saw the Communist Party as the state and as a blunt instrument to be used against enemies. And he had during the Cultural Revolution a slogan, let 100 flowers bloom and 1,000 schools contend. You know, it doesn't get more poetic than that. Let 100 flowers bloom and 1,000 schools contend. Yeah. And, but maybe he anticipated Deng Xiaoping, you know, and an openness. But anyway, so the American party system, though there are two parties, but the two parties are made up of many different camps. Italy has a multi-party system, but it is not that different in essence from the US two-party system. And what has been almost brilliant in its effectiveness of the two-party system, at least over the last 80 years of the Cold War, since World War II, is the fact that a center, a median point, a point of meeting even, after an election in order to govern, which meant that compromise, give and take, and so on, was the order of the day. And so, and they are two different coalitions. And so when people say, oh, they're both the same, well, not really. Oh, they're both totally controlled by the ruling class. Not totally. Everybody is a tool, a puppet of the rich. Not quite. Okay? I mean, all of those assumptions and wild, absurd statements, I mean, really don't apply to real life and do not even come close to expressing the way people, individuals, politically behave and how they make political choices. You know, if you take the Democratic Party of Franklin Roosevelt going into Lyndon Johnson, and that is the, I would say, the great period for the Democratic Party, party of justice for labor, for Black people, and so on. And it was in order to be successful in elections, it had to understand what its coalition was. And once Black people got the right to vote, that they were strategic, you know, and labor and so on and so forth. Well, those rules don't apply when the center has not held. When politics is now, I don't know, maybe what they're saying, the Communist Party was saying, you know, I don't think they know what they're trying to say. But when politicians no longer adhere to the proposition, the principle of the vital center, the question is, how do you rule? How do you govern? Without a vital center, a unity of political forces, you pretty much can't govern. And that's why a different consensus thought out on, well, you could say the extremes. I mean, it's something more like this. It is a dynamic and alive situation. This is what Nuri was saying. more alive and more dynamic than perhaps ever in 80 years, maybe 100 years. It's unprecedented. And one party, which is not the Republic, it is the Trump party. The Trump party is challenging the right of those who control the state to do so.
Can I ask
Yes,
something?
please.
I feel like this relates, something I've written down and didn't really think about from last week was also how basically you would also say with this, like, I just feel like this really disproves the need for like a revolutionary third party, or the fact that there's so many, the format that the left has been trying to like revive around like a party, a third party. Like, it doesn't really seem like it actually is the right mechanism because of what we're saying. Or maybe, I don't know.
Can I just respond to that? This is huge because now I think it will be a distraction where you'll hear all of these fringe, I call a lot of them lunatic fringe, or on the autistic spectrum fringe. Yes. They were all now, in spite of their emptiness and lack of any authority or power among the people, now they will shout to the rooftops, "We need a third party." You're going to hear, "Oh, will you shut up?" Because you can't, even if we do need one, you don't have the capacity or authority to bring it into existence. No, okay, I'm going out on a limb. I don't think revolutionary movements are party movements. They are movements. And I think the Chinese Revolution is a better example than the Russian Revolution because of that long period, that 20-year period between let us say, maybe 25 years with Sun Yat-sen. But what was the Chinese Revolution? It was a movement with tremendous campaigns. Now, the Communist Party of China was part of that great movement. And the party becomes important. Well, in the Cuban Revolution, it was the July 26 movement that when they came into Havana and moved to take power, then they united with other parties to form the Socialist Party of Cuba, to form the Communist Party. And that was the party of government. But up to that point, it was a movement. So the call, "Oh, we have to form a third people's party," you're going to hear that all day and all night long. And that's when I'm going to break my addiction to YouTube and podcasts. Yeah, they're going to wear that out. But no, we need a movement that is a coalition of all democratic forces. And that will be maybe the first and biggest test of the capacity of the people. Now, we've seen this, I know, especially at Lucian Blackwell in our conversations, to a certain extent in the Central Branch. I don't know about other places. But one of the things that we talked about very openly last week is the possibility of a revolutionary struggle. And a couple of people didn't see its possibility, and so on and so forth. I think because of how they imagine a revolutionary struggle. They don't see it as evolving, as many things occurring at the same time. It might look different in Philly than it does in Chicago. Matter of fact, I see us so close to the people trying to take power away from these bums that run this government now that it's not even funny. But yeah, that's I think that's why this concept of a humanity movement for peace and democracy, you know, and this idea of a peace industrial economy, and things like that. Other people might have their own ideas, but I think that's where we are in history. And that's why King and the Civil Rights Movement is a better paradigm than the imaginary Russian Revolution. It didn't happen that way, I'd like to say over and over again. That's a movie. Workers Storming the Winter Palace is a movie. It's not even a documentary. It's a cinematic recreation. I hate to burst the bubble on that one. The Tsar had already left. They just walked in.
Right. I mean, I wanted to add to this, like, when you talk about the two-party system and comparing it to China and the one part and all of that, I was thinking of how, yes, like every nation, but probably every civilization has to have a sense of its direction. And, like what you're saying, the consensus is towards which the whole country is going to move towards. And I think this is a time where the crisis of, which, I mean, we talk about this on and off, but the crisis of white civilization or Western civilization really is that we don't have a consensus right now. And this is where, I mean, even now, all of these, a lot of these articles coming out about the Trump presidents and so on, the ruling class also sort of talks about the Trump movement as a defense of Western civilization. And I think it's partly, partly true because like RFK and so on, they had this, like, I think they have this sense of a movement which, like, they accept that the West is in crisis, Western civilization is in crisis, and it's going to, all be recovered by the Trump movement alone. But then the ruling class itself also represents white supremacy and a civilization that's based on white supremacy, which is in crisis. So this is the crisis of civilization has to, I think that takes into account this stage of history especially in this country much more clearly, because, and this is why I was thinking the Trump movement, I mean, when you say that, yes, to compare it to the Russian Revolution, I think the Russian Revolution did not have a civilizational component to it in the same way that the civil rights movement or anti-colonial struggles did. I mean, they all had to first be a defense of civilization. And I think the Trump movement now, it seems that, it's not even about the Trump movement, but the stage of the American revolutionary process requires a renewal of civilizational, of, like a new way of asking civilizational questions. And which is why it's actually very deep that we have been talking about this question of, oh, can we talk about the class struggle? Can we look at what's happening right now? Can we look at it simply with, like, the categories of the left, which, like, 100-year-old categories of the left, or do we have to look for something new? But I think this is the way I'm thinking about it, is that, yes, the consensus about where where this civilization is going to go. This is not to be like, this is going to require new ways of thinking which come from a civilizational wellspring, and not simply a question of, it's not simply a question of the state in the Leninist sense, or like economy and all of that. Yeah.
I guess the irony is that, like, Du Bois saw in the Soviet Union a kind of civilizational project that maybe even the people in the Soviet Union didn't clearly articulate. Because that's, like, if you read Russia and America, like, so much of how he understands, like, what the Soviet Union is achieving is, like, on civilizational, like, that's the kind of language he uses. But I guess the larger thing is that even in terms of, like, our relationship to, like, Marxism, whatever, I guess, because I know we talked about this last week too, I guess maybe it's less about, like, us making a quote-unquote departure from even previous schools of thought, but it's that and this is like I guess my way of thinking about it. It's that we assume certain things, we also draw certain things from like that intellect, like that kind of ideological tradition, but our thinking is not dominated by it. And we draw what's useful from it, but we're also interested in actually like what is, regardless of whether you call yourself like a Marxist or whatever, what really matters is like what is this, like what is the kind of science that is actually appropriate for this time, for this place, for these people, and for this struggle.
Yeah.
And if there are parts of Marxism that are useful, then we draw from it. And I think we do, like we do draw from it, and we shouldn't be like, I don't know, like ashamed of drawing in part from like the Marxist tradition. But I guess it's one of the larger questions, this is unrelated, but I guess one of the larger questions was like this whole thing of a movement is like, I do think it's worth asking what kind of movement is MAGA, because
Right.
the kind of what you would associate, for instance, with the civil rights movement, it's like on the one hand, you can say MAGA is made possible by the civil rights movement, but the way, it's not even just like who's in the America First movement, but even like what are its goals? Like what is it actually achieving aside from essentially electoral victories? I think that's part of the question of like, can all these people who are like, oh, I'm part of a movement, can they even move, like ascend to a higher stage of like, okay, like the point of our movement is not even like just to like elect a particular figure, or to like, that it can't always be. I think this is also why there's a lot of confusion too about like what even Trump represents, because like when he says like, oh, me and my movement, it's like most of the time the way that movement, like if it has goals, it's basically to elect Trump. And I think that like now that Trump has already been elected, the question is like thrust onto people who would say like, oh, I'm part of the MAGA movement. Like, okay, like what is your movement about now? And like, can it actually ascend to a higher stage of like, our goal is actually to try to like make an impact, not just on like the electoral level, but also like to try to reach different parts of the American people. And that's an open question of whether they will even recognize that as like a possible next task, or like even a new way of organizing themselves, and like understanding like their reason for existing as part of quote unquote a movement.
Yeah, I think that that's a critical question I've been thinking about since everyone's been talking today, because this question of what is the MAGA movement? It seems like there's sort of a consensus that this isn't a bad thing, and I'm hearing that. I'm here to see how y'all feel about it. At the same time, I'm trying to see how I can hold that sentiment with this idea that Tony, you brought up, of like an all humanity movement, and the things that I agree with from watching the Baldwin documentary the last time that I attended, and all those ideals of what could be in a movement. And I just want to pose a couple of questions, like how do you hold the idea that the MAGA movement could be useful potentially in the midst of like the moral proclivities, let's say, of Trump at all, right? Which I would pose are like potentially white supremacy, misogyny. Like these are not, I don't think, unfair claims to put on his, compatriots, right? And if you can hold those two at the same time, like what then are the measures of his promises to the people? Like how do we actually judge whether what you guys are kind of saying could be good are achieved? And like versus, is he not still like for the ruling class? And this, I mean, you kind of talked about that Altman and the technocrats and Zuckerberg or whatever may not be the ruling class, and I would say to that who are, and is he still in bed with others that are? Because it doesn't feel like he's like, as we said with Luigi, when we talked about him a couple of weeks ago. Like it doesn't feel like he's the leader of the movement, even if the actions he's taken are like bold and gained a lot of attention and attraction among the populist base that he serves. Or I wouldn't even say he serves the populist base. I think he's really good at branding himself. He's a reality TV show host. Like, that's what he's really good at. And in some ways, I question whether there's actually a vision. It sounds like a lot of the discussion has been about Trump as this like visionary, maybe without saying it, but like it seems to be the sentiment. I don't know if I agree with that. I don't know if he has like, I don't know, maybe I'm just like buying into the typical like liberal critiques of him, but I don't see him as like an intelligent person. I think he's like a narcissist that is very good at wanting the spotlight and knows how to get it. And I guess one of the final questions, I mean, we brought up like, Jeremiah, you were saying like, what is this kind of, what kind of movement is MAGA? Did the civil rights movement enable this? And what are its aims? What are its goals? Which is what I'm trying to get down to too. And one of my questions there is, are some of those goals not stated in things like Project 2025? And if we're around this table right now, like, talking about the revolutionary potential of a Trump presidency, while like, and again, I appreciate the nuance, the debate about immigration, right? I'm not saying, oh, because he's taken this one stance, it's all like from the, you know, from the poison well, right? But I'm curious to see why or how like you guys don't see many of the obvious, at least from a, I guess, standard liberal point of view, like scare tactics. It's like not things to pay attention to. And if they aren't things to pay attention to, what is the measure of whether this is actually going to be a good direction, if at all? That's what I'm curious about. Because like when I walk away from these conversations, my goal is like, what the fuck can I do action-wise to make a better society, not just pontificate and wait for like what's going to happen. So those are just a few of the things that have been floating in my mind as we've talked. And I guess again, how do we hold at the same time many of the like real critiques of like, let's just say like moral critiques of who these people are? Like Trump isn't King. Like he's not. Like he's not the same person. And Trump isn't Bernie Sanders. Trump isn't a white, like someone brought up the idea that he's sort of like the poor white. Like in terms of his branding, yeah, of course he does that. But like he wasn't raised in poverty.
No, I mean, but I mean, this is not to make an equation, but like neither was Fidel Castro. Like,
yeah, and I'm not saying that a great leader has to be of poverty, but I'm saying like, because I know was it Huey Newton or was it another or was it Fred Hampton who kind of made that assumption too, that like he was of a bourgeois class, but he still fought for the working class. I'm not saying you can't have those two at once. I'm just like, I really question whether Trump is that. Like, can Trump be of the bourgeois class and fight for the working class? I don't know if I believe that. And I'm kind of trying to get you guys to give me some reason to believe it. In one way would be like, what are going to be the measures that we hold him to confirm that he does it or not? Because if he doesn't, I'm tired of waiting around to like for a hero to come save the day. Because otherwise, I'm trying to get in the fight and be someone that actually like feels like there's a, like, how do you judge whether the leader that we're looking at is the right person to do the job?
Right. I think this is okay.
You know, what you're saying, you probably represent the sentiment of a lot of people.
Sure.
But what I think you're getting at is what we sometimes call a perfect solution.
Mm-hmm.
Trump is not the perfect solution. I don't think they're saying that.
Okay.
But what Trump represents is a break in the way things are going. So oftentimes people like, you know, like your sentiment is this perfect solution. I don't think anybody here saying Trump is king. Or I'm sure they're not. I'm sure they're not. And what I think they're saying is that he's he's criticizing, he's criticizing the overall structure of the, and it's a breakthrough. And after this, it's like a movement, a change in the thinking. Because like Alex pointed out about the change, this is 2024. The change in white consciousness, there's a change in that. The gender, think about all the cultural things, the gender things. He's raising questions about the bureaucracy. Those are things that
We're just accepted in the paradigm.
But he is not, and the war thing. Think about the war. So think about it. He's not the perfect solution, you know. And people always want to characterize him as the evil guy. That's the, you know, that's how they want to characterize. But is he really the evil guy? Is he really the evil guy? And if you want to believe, so if you want to believe that, then you'll go with that he's bad. Yeah. But I think what they're saying and what I get, because I get into arguments with people that you support Trump. I don't really support him like, you know, support him. But I do support that he's questioning his system.
Yeah.
And that, do you see that? I mean, do you see that?
Yeah, I agree. Totally agree. I'm all for like, let's support people that really question the system.
Right.
My question is, when the power vacuum gets, like now that there's a power vacuum, there's a crack in the armor,
Right.
will he be the type of person to invite the next step or the solutions to the problem? I take no issue with the fact that he's like called out the problems that many Americans feel and face. My question is, can we all be happy about that while also acknowledge, like, is it okay to be happy about that while also acknowledging that the intentions of his next steps may not actually solve the problems?
Right.
And what then do we do about that?
Right. Well, you know, I wanted to, like, firstly, I think Trump is the best that American civilization has been able to produce at this moment in electoral politics to address this question, right? I mean, that's why Trump is the first real attack on the deep state in modern times.
So, quick question on that.
Mhm.
Because again, I'm just trying to learn here. It seems like a consensus that I may not share or I may not understand. Why is Trump the best versus Bernie Sanders?
Right. So I think the question goes to
I know
what
that's
you
like
were-
probably a classic liberal take. I'm just like
No,
trying
no.
to understand here.
Yeah. I think, because what you were saying right before about immigration, I don't think there's any nuance about it. I think, like, for instance, why do we think that immigration is something that should be, like, why do we think it's a morally virtuous thing?
I mean, when I feel like the class,
But okay, but I feel like
No,
even this whole thing of like Bernie Sanders though, it's like, okay, if you're, because part of I feel like the underlying assumptions is that like a potentially revolutionary, or at least a leader who actually progresses people towards actually resolving the contradictions of American society, that the underlying assumption is that like that would be someone who not just unites the working class, but also fights for the working class. And therefore Bernie kind of encapsulates that much more. Is that kind of like what you're, I guess, the general argument that you're making, or the—
well, no, I mean, the question is literally like, if Trump presents an opportunity to change, and your point is that he's the best that America has to offer to actually initiate.
Well, I mean, but even
Yeah,
on this
because
question, but it's like even on this question of like morality, which I think is a very loaded, and I think it's not always an honest way that we talk about this question of morality, because it's like, okay, from my perspective, Bernie has basically spent the past year and a half providing cover for the Democratic Party, even while he's like, oh, like what's happening in Gaza is so bad, and like I'm gonna appear to criticize the Biden administration, but basically I'm still gonna encourage people to vote Democrat.
Right.
That to me that's like the worst moral crime that you can make. So like I don't like, to me it's like I think part of the kind of general phenomenon with Trump, and like also, yeah, you don't have to like agree with like either how I see it or anyone else sees it, but it's like part of what Trump represents is like this kind of break with people being like, okay, I'm sick of you telling me what is right and what is not right. When it's like, I've seen you the whole time basically being monsters And it's like, why should I accept
You
your
like to call it hypocrisy.
No, yeah. So like, why should people accept basically the kind of narrative of like, okay, this is what's moral and this is what's immoral? And it's like, yeah, like no one is saying that Trump even represents like what morality is. And we talked about that before the election of like why Trump himself is like, he doesn't even come close to capturing what is like needed for a moral center in a society which is like basically tearing itself apart or is undergoing a crisis. Like we've talked about that a lot, but I think part of it is like, okay, like at a certain level, like I don't like Trump may say despicable things about Palestinians, for instance, but it's like he's still the one who got the ceasefire deal done. And like he may say things, for like the other example, he may say things about like Koreans, for instance, but it's like if he's able to broker some kind of, you know, agreement between North and South Korea and the US, like do I care ultimately? Like if he said things that are like nasty or
Okay,
said
so
things,
those are the measurable, so you're answering
Yeah.
my question, which was, what are then the measurable ways
Right,
that
yeah.
we would expect him
Yeah.
as a leader to adhere to what he promised, which is okay, and name wars, and I'm totally down with it. We watch that happen. I'm just saying, if we watch that not happen, what the fuck are we gonna do? Pardon my language, but like that's
No,
how I feel.
Yeah, I guess the question is what were we doing like till yesterday? That's, I mean, it's not a new phenomena, right? That's what we're trying to say.
I understand,
So,
but I'm
like,
saying,
for instance,
if
even the
if he's popped out as someone that now, like, what have we been doing? But we're saying now is the moment.
Hmm.
He is here. And I guess you're right in pointing out that I'm just like, maybe I'm kind of surprised that this is the leader we're like, we've been given or we deserve in this moment to do what we're all, I think, around the table trying to work towards doing.
I think the
Yeah, I mean, like also the other thing is, but the thing Jeremiah was also talking about and what you were saying before is, I think what he does represent, how I think is, yeah, I mean, really for us to question what we have taken to be, the moral standards of our time. I mean, we talk about immigration as though, going back to what you were saying, we talk about immigration the way we do because we take it for granted that the fact that from the world over people are immigrating to the west for a better life, this is not a god-given reality. It's because of war. It's because of war that that's why immigration is talked about, it's maintained. Yeah, so the breaking down of immigration, I don't see any nuance in that. It's simply that immigration should not be looked at as the positive step in. It's not the positive virtuous thing it's made out to be. As long as it's compatible
if
with
we talk
war.
about King as being a leader who followed the, let's say, just the wisdom of Christ, like a Christ-like consciousness, right? We could easily talk about Christ-like consciousness as one that is about welcoming the stranger and taking care of the poor, right? Which I think some people would in the argument for like the pro-immigration, open borders, like maybe delusional leftist policy. I'm not saying I agree with it, but that's what they equated to, is like welcoming the stranger. And so is there, I guess I'm trying to find in this conversation, or like, and maybe there isn't, is there a moral like path to follow, or is that just a smokescreen and we just like Trump is our leader, offer a better path?
Well, I feel like the underlying assumption of also what you're saying is like what do you see as the decisive force of history, or what do you see as like the driving forces of movement, of revolution, of social change? And I think this is why like we lean so heavily on Du Bois or study like the Reconstruction era the way we do. And it's because like do you see like Trump being this over determining force in like whether or not we are able to progress as a nation, or do you also see like that Trump is a product of like historical, social, political forces that originated 200, 400 years ago? And so like when Alice says something like, oh, like Trump sounds like or talks like a poor white, like you can see the origins of that as being, well, like Du Bois talking about there being like the black worker, the poor white,
Psychological wage.
and there's a certain like psychological, philosophical underpinning that creates like the system that we live in today. And so like it is interesting actually that Trump sounds like a poor white, because you would think that instead he would sound like why doesn't he sound like a Jeff Bezos? Or why doesn't he sound like the plancher class of that time? And it actually speaks to the fact that there's certain gains that have been made since like the Reconstruction era, after the civil rights movement. And so when we like in asking the question of, well, how can we look at Trump in a way, or how do we like assess the situation in a way that brings us closest to reality? Like I think you can only answer that question by like also taking into account like the historical social forces that produced Trump and also that produced the movement. And I also think the Reconstruction era is interesting because like we were kind of reading yesterday about how like during that time there were actually two movements that were taking place that were in conflict with each other. There's the Free Soil movement, and then there's also the abolitionist movement. And the Free Soilers were in favor of like improving working conditions for people, for working people, like trying to increase wages, focused on like getting land, like just the abundance of land in the West. And the abolition movement was focused on the moral argument of abolishing slavery. And they saw themselves in competition with each other, when in reality, they needed to work in conjunction with each other to be one large movement that would eradicate slavery and also create like an industrial system that was more just for all people, for all labor. And that, in a sense, was the fault. Like the contradiction is that that was never recognized. Like there was no recognition of that. So like that's why I think this question of like, well, what is the agency of the people? Like, can the people come to a shared understanding what's happening now is so important, because then the question that you're asking of, well, what do I do? Like can be answered by like, well, what is the Trump movement? Like that is an important question to ask, right? Because that is related to, well, what am I gonna do? And like what does need to happen? Can the MAGA movement become like an all humanity struggle, which is essentially what it needs to be? Like it's like the problem with Bernie Sanders, like the Social Democrats, is that like why is it that now they're they're claiming the moral argument, that like the moral high ground of like, oh, immigrants, like all these people being deported, kids in cages, like ICE and all of that. Like how can they say that and yet throughout the past like 4 years, like say nothing or actually justify the genocide against the Palestinians? And that I think is the place of like, well, we're trying to identify like what those contradictions are and find a means to help like the American people see those contradictions and the need to resolve like that contradiction. So
yeah, and my just to respond to a couple of your points. When I called out Alice's point about Trump sounding like a poor white, I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm saying he's very good at it. And yes, I understand the historical context of Du Bois and like the psychological wage and how he taps into that in a modern context. What I'm questioning is like if he's just like good at using that for his own needs.
Since you said my name, I guess I want to ask a question, which is, or not ask a question, is or pose something, which is that along with your argument, you're basically saying that like more than 70 million people are unable to detect BS. And when we say, in our experiences, at least in free school in Philadelphia, like especially among like ordinary people, they're pretty good at detecting BS. And so if he's a performer, then he's a damn good performer. Then and there are elements of it, and there are elements of it. He's a TV personality, but there are also pieces that you can't, that are genuine. Because I know we've also had discussions about Obama and how actually he parades as a Black person. And that is detectable. People detect Black people, ordinary Black people, some of them, and I'm not saying all of them, detect that. And so I think the question for you, or the question that we're posing is that, okay, there are some elements that are of a performer, but then there are other elements that are genuine. And because he sticks out like a sore thumb among these other individuals who are of the ruling elite, that's also why they show disgust for him, because they also show disgust for the average poor white that actually talks like him. And I mean, that's just a wormhole that we're getting into. But I also want to take a step back, because this question that you're asking of what do I do, or is all of this, is a question that a lot of young people are asking, which is they're fed up with the lies and the pessimism and the future of this country. And I think oftentimes the trap of it is to fall into a certain nihilism and a certain impatience and a certain humility, which is what we're saying here is that we're talking, and some of the attacks of free school is like, you guys are all just a bunch of people who are talking. But the thing is, for those who don't talk or don't conversate with each other or ordinary people, is that you fall into the traps of what is told by liberal media, which is that Trump is the enemy. And then you spend the next 2 years of your life campaigning against him. But where would have those efforts? And then that becomes the question of what do you do? Ideas of impact what you think. And I think even in this discourse that we're having, we're not going to resolve it in one conversation. And that's why, Trump is being he's elected. And what we're arguing is that he's not an individual actor. And it does depend on us and others that we talk to figure out and to influence like what a democracy looks like. But for right now, I think it's a point that Shimbarto raised, is that what is the stage of the American revolutionary process that we're in right now?
Right.
It's filled with contradictions. And the next step is up to us to make clear, have ideological clarity, which is, yes, Trump is not king, but what are the significant advances that he has made for humanity? The stop of Palestinian children being bombed. And I'm saying all of this is that ideological clarity we talk about, and all of us are young, most of us are young, and we come in dismissing it, saying I already know all of this. But it takes so much work. This past week, so much has happened. And we're like, okay, how do we make sense of it? And, Jeremiah brought the introduction, we're talking about it, and it'll continue next week and the week after. And I think the other part is, yes, okay, we're not at King, we're not at the civil rights movement. How do we get from here, which is the contradiction and bumbling of America, to the vision of King? And the question that you're asking is accurate, which is, what is the vision of America? Right now, it's dealing a blow at the greatest enemy of the people, but then what is that vision? And that's something that we're all trying to answer. And it's not going to happen in one conversation. It happens in conversation, and then in figuring out with in Philadelphia, wherever people are. But I just say all that to say, I think I can sense your frustration, which is what do I do? What do I do? And it's hard to do when you don't understand the situation. And that's the trap for a lot of young people, including us. Jeremiah mentioned earlier about back then, I forget what year, 2016.
Yeah.
We were like, oh shoot, he's the enemy. I need to do something.
Yeah.
And then you go into this protest, and you're so livid. And then afterwards, it just fizzles away. And so, and that's the question I'm bringing, which is, we're young, there's that energy, but then it also needs to be channeled in a strategic way.
Yeah.
Just to add to what Alice is saying, I think even in raising the question of morality, isn't one of the great moral imperatives, especially for young people, is to actually know your own people. That is I think this is partially where it's even on this question of Trump, aside from even evaluating Trump's own morality, whatever you use, it's okay, I've at least been to Trump rallies with Eddie and Porvo, but it's like Alice said, there's this assumption that Trump is just hoodwinking all these poor, dumb, gullible people and all that stuff. And there is Trump, I don't even think Trump tries to hide that he's a showman, that he plays into the bombast. But I think it's when we say a moral imperative, I actually do think that part of our moral, if we even think of ourselves as wanting to be revolutionaries, our moral imperative is to actually try to understand the American people.
Right.
And whether that's the Trump supporters, but it's also people who don't support Trump. And that's also part of it. But I think it's okay, maybe the way that people who are in like the whole MAGA base, the way that they evaluate Trump, it's like different actually than the kind of what you would project as like, oh, like why don't they see that he's like a charlatan, that like he's like all that. And I think part of it is like, I think that we should all be open to actually like the actual reality of how the American people are thinking and how they're behaving and what they see as the tasks ahead of them. We should be open to actually like trying to understand it on the people's own terms rather than always trying to impose like our sense of like, oh, this is what I think is moral or this is what I think is right. When it's like part of the immorality, I think, of the left is that like they don't actually care about the American people and they're not even interested in the American people. And that's why they're so comfortable with essentially siding with the ruling class and being like, oh, they're all a basket of deplorables. And it's like that, like that's not presented as like a moral sin, but I think that is like one of the greatest moral sins that you can commit, not even against like other people, but also against yourself. And it's like this whole thing of like, oh, what are we going to do? Like, this is, I don't know, maybe a flippant way of saying it, but like we've been trying to do that basically for the past year, and also like for the past couple of years, where it's like if you think about success merely in terms of like whether or not you can organize a protest or not, then like you can go to PSL for that or something. But it's like what we're interested in is actually trying to bring people together to talk exactly about the kinds of questions that we think actually matter for this time. And like that's like not just why we talk here, but also like like why we do all the reading groups around the city, like why we do the documentary screening, which you came to. And I don't think that most people, I guess, who see themselves as like revolutionaries, like see any value in that. But like that's part of what we see our goal as. And I think this whole question of like what is moral and all that stuff, I think it sidesteps the question of like, do you even understand your own people to begin with? And if you don't understand them, like shouldn't you try to understand the people? But I guess that's like kind of how I think about it, because I feel like it's very easy, especially like Alice was saying, back when, especially when Trump was first elected, it was very easy to like assume a kind of moral high ground that didn't actually exist, I guess.
Because I think also my question is, like, if the moral imperative, like, is to know and also to act, then I would really love for all the sincere, like, people on the left or the people who have, like, say they have a moral vision for America, to not waste the next 4 years just being like, I hate Trump, I hate Trump, I hate Trump. And I feel like that is basically where a lot of the energy is getting funneled, where like you have the January 20th, that protest thing, and then also like on TikTok after it got reinstated, now there's like all this discourse of like, I'm gonna like boycott, like I hate Trump. And it's like, can we actually, like have a bit of a higher standard or an actual goal where like, I don't really like, if it's MAGA that does it, that's great. If it's not MAGA that does it, I don't like, that's also great. But I feel like the point is that the American people actually need like a revolution. And I feel like it's a race to see like who can actually get there, like who will actually have the capacity to do it. Because like literally it's either the people have something or it's just greater chaos for the next like 4, 10, however many years. Also, I feel like there were a lot of comments, like not a lot, but let's see. Okay, Matt asks, yes, like what actually is MAGA? Is there any coherent political project? Our analysis of Trump and MAGA should be as critical as any other movement. And then, right, all of what we've observed so far could pan out to nothingness. I think this is about Trump's executive orders. Like it could fizzle into just like intriguing rhetoric and symbolic actions, which I think is true. But then we also talked about what the concrete actual measures of Trump's actions, like what the consequences would be, how to actually evaluate it beyond that. BK, I think we know that he's a big skeptic, but says, yeah, don't take the theater at face value. There needs to be a more precise term in place of MAGA, and the masses only have themselves. Todd asks, is there a chance that Trump removed Pompeo and Bolton's security details to virtue signal to Iran? Also because Witkoff is going to be the envoy. Yeah. And then BK also says, Trump alluded to building beachfront properties in the Gaza rebuild, doing good for big business and Palestinians. And M. Spark says, yeah, Zion Dawn strikes again. And BK says, yeah, the Zionists are draped all over him, LOL. And so I guess we'll see what actually comes of that. JDM Phil says, social democracy's shortfall in the West has always been America. It's a radical position to take in the US that, when it's articulated clearly without obfuscation, could build a mass movement. Sanders proved that it's possible for social democracy to gain executive power in the United States. The problem are the liberal centrists and radical liberals who are still invested in their own breed of radical individualism. Well, I feel like the other thing with like Bernie and Trump is that I feel like the ideals or the ideas that each man like purportedly represents, I feel like takes us a certain distance in terms of understanding like, oh, this is the appeal or this is the traction of the idea amongst the people. But then I feel like the other thing is that the person themselves, like, they actually also matter, which is that Bernie ran for president twice, and both times he just gave up and he was like, oh, like, I'm just going to give it to Biden, or I'm just going to give it to the establishment Democrats. And I feel like that idea was only able to go so far, literally because Bernie capitulated like that. And so I feel like the thing is that like Trump, I feel like at least is a fighter and will be able to see where things go a little bit further than actually we have been able to see with Bernie, because I feel like he's comfortable making certain statements of like, yeah, like the Democrats messed up, like they shouldn't have run Kamala after they lost the election. But I feel like he's fine, like basically playing that very limited role where there's a place in the discourse, but then, yeah, where does it go? Because if people are just going to keep hanging on to Bernie, I feel like he's only willing to fight so far. And then, sorry, one more. Jahan just commented and said, it was impressive to see Trump visit people in North Carolina who have been underwater for 4 months. He went there instead of Davos, and made a point of visiting them right before going to LA. It was impressive to see him highlight these people forgotten by the Biden admin and the media. Trump even gave flood victims the mic to talk about how insurance companies have fleeced them. And FEMA and other government agencies ignored them. I would imagine his putting public pressure on California officials to rebuild faster will also strengthen his image as a populist fighter. Yeah, those are all of them. Yeah. Shall we end?
I think it's about that time.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.